In 1930, Britain's railways celebrated the centenary of the opening of the world's first public passenger railway, the Liverpool and Manchester. They were at the height of their power and influence, but the next half-century was to see a precipitous fall from grace, followed by a long and painful rise as they responded to the calls for changes in their ethos from a freight-based industry to a passenger-based one. This locomotive, Lion, was one of a pair of goods engines built in 1838 for the Liverpool and Manchester and had been restored to working order for the centenary celebrations. The crew of Lion would not have found the shunting of the wagons and the working arrangements of the 1930s seen here very much different to those with which they were familiar. Freight or goods traffic had been the backbone of the British railway system from its earliest days, the first railways being built to serve the massive coal industry, the country's indigenous source of power. And herein lay the seeds of the problem, which was about to overwhelm the railway companies in the middle of the 20th century. Obsolete working practices and the huge investment in small wooden-bodied wagons for coal carriage by non-railway private owners had combined to make it difficult for the railways to adapt to the rapidly changing circumstances of the threat of direct competition from road transport. The railways were very labour-intensive. Staff worked long hours and frequently lived in company-supplied housing. The whole organisation worked like an extended family, and many generations of a family would work for the railways. The elite, of course, were the locomotive crews, whose daily life was recorded in this LMS film of the 1930s. As can be seen here, the life of a footplate man was quite varied, although it was a hard life. In an age where long-distance travel was a rarity and a good number of people seldom ventured beyond their own home villages or towns, locomotive crews were unusual in the distances they travelled, making them far more cosmopolitan than their fellows. It took many years to work one's way up through the hierarchy to the position of a top-link driver, such as the subject of this feature. They acquired many skills and had quite a glamorous image, although, as this film shows, the reality was somewhat different, and it was still quite a physical occupation even at the top level. Nevertheless, driving the later steam giants with their stirring names was something to aspire to, and there were few little boys who didn't dream of growing up to be an engine driver. Partly due to the links with the coal industry, steam engines still dominated the railways. The basic design hadn't really changed much over that first century, and again Lion's engine crew would have quickly understood this LMS Jubilee class express engine. They would have been impressed by its size, of course, but it still had a boiler and firebox to create steam from water by burning coal. The boiler itself was simply a sophisticated enlargement of the multi-tube boiler pioneered by George Stephenson in his immortal rocket, which had won the famous Rainhill trials of 1829 and formed the backbone to the Liverpool and Manchester Railway's world-leading debut the following year. Many improvements had been made over the years, but it was still extremely labour-intensive, and the railways were to find that the shifting expectations of employees would be one of the greatest problems of the 20th century. The First World War had led to dramatic changes in society, and in 1926 the railways had been shattered by the effects of the general strike, which had its seeds in the railway industry's close associate, the mining industry. The war meant the country had depleted its best reserves and used a higher proportion of production, resulting in reduced exports. So foreign producers had been able to fill the gap in what had been a profitable export trade for Britain. Productivity also fell in the first half of the 1920s, to which was added the Dawes Plan of 1925, which saw Germany re-entering the export market with free coal for France and Belgium as war reparations. At the same time, the reintroduction of the gold standard made the pound strong and hampered exports. A slump in the price of coal resulted, and mine owners tried to maintain their profits by reducing staff wages. Miners went on strike the following year, and the TUC also brought out transport workers to support them. This was to cause massive changes in the way employers and employees interacted in subsequent times. In the 1920s, few foresaw these changes. The railways were still the main form of transport for passengers and freight, as private motoring was still mainly the preserve of the rich, although popular motoring changed out of all recognition during the decade. It was a decade of massive change throughout the world, but particularly in Europe. Holidays with pay became more common, and working practices changed substantially. Mobility was no longer the preserve of the better off, and the railway's customers changed. As industrial priorities also changed, so did the freight traffic carried by the railways and its competitors. This brought to a head another problem, which was the statutory requirement of the railways to be common carriers, which meant that they had to accept any business presented to them at rates laid down by Parliament, including passenger fares. The devastating effects of the First World War had accelerated this. Using war surplus vehicles, many new road hauliers set up in business, free to use the roads provided by government and to take any business at whatever rates they chose. So it followed that they cherry-picked the best which had been carried by rail. The railways had borne the brunt of the war effort and emerged with massive debts and maintenance backlogs which the government was loath to fund. Rather than bailing the companies out, the lawmakers required more than 120 independent railway companies to merge into four, known as the Big Four. These were the London, Midland and Scottish, London and North Eastern, Great Western and Southern Railways, formed in 1923. All inherited locomotives and trains dating from the Edwardian era, and by the 1930s their management had welded them into effective entities and were starting to tackle the problems which had been presented. All had diversified and were in the process of creating integrated transport businesses with buses, lorries, aircraft, shipping and hotel subsidiaries in addition to their railway networks. The public face of the railways were their passenger services, and the presentation of these were the new company's first priority. The largest of the Big Four was the LMS, principally the result of a merger of two of the biggest of the Victorian railway companies, the London and North Western and the Midland. These had been bitter rivals for the Scottish traffic on the west side of the country, and this was carried over into the new company, causing its early days to be defined by internal struggles. This was most obvious in its locomotive policy, whereby obsolete Edwardian designs of small locomotives used by the Midland Railway became standard designs for the new LMS. Small 440 and 060 classes were mass-produced and used throughout the system, even on lines where they were totally unsuitable. This resulted in a crisis in the mid-1920s, which led to the LMS placing a rush order with the North British Locomotive Company to produce a modern express passenger locomotive at short notice. The result was the Royal Scot class, members of which bore names associated with the Empire and all things British. Here we see Lord Baden-Powell naming a pair of them at Euston Station.
I feel it a great honour to uncover this plaque and name the engine the Boy Scout. And I hope he'll have a successful run for many years to come and give many people the pleasure of going along easily and well about their business. Good luck to the Boy Scout.
Number 6169 was the last of these 70 big express locomotives which were placed in service on the West Coast Main Line. But there were no other large express designs on the drawing board, although a lighter version, the Patriots, did follow. The Midland influence still reigned supreme in the form of Sir Henry Fowler, the LMS's chief locomotive engineer. Some enlargement of Midland practice followed, including tank engines and goods engines, and a small number of massive Bear Garretts. However, all were hobbled by inadequate bearings and other Midland standard features. At the end of the 1920s, the LMS still relied on the little compounds, a Midland design from the previous century, for most of its principal express workings. By contrast, the second largest of the Big Four was the LNER, whose three main constituents had worked together, rather than as rivals, to form the Anglo-Scottish East Coast Main Line. Although there was an inheritance of small engines like this Great Northern one, the LNER, despite being somewhat poorer than the LMS, was able to follow a coherent locomotive and train policy, led by the extremely able Nigel Gresley. the famous Flying Scotsman train was introduced, taking 8¼ hours from London to Edinburgh, a journey which was to be run non-stop in the summer from 1927. The LNER was very astute in its marketing, and this was seen to be very cutting edge at that time. This was further emphasised by the inclusion of such luxuries as a hairdressing saloon and a cocktail bar. The locomotives used were Gresley's A1 Pacifics, the largest express passenger locomotives in Britain in the 1920s. These bore the names of famous racehorses, and the first one, built by the LNER itself, was named Flying Scotsman, the same as the train, and later to become a legend in its own right. The publicity department made the most of it. The Gresley policy extended to goods and mixed traffic locomotives, as well as to the prestigious express passenger types. He had been in charge of locomotive and carriage affairs on the Great Northern Railway, which operated the southern portion of the East Coast Main Line from London King's Cross to York, since before the Great War, so his superintendency on the LNER was a continuation of that service, and the LNER got off to a very smooth start in its mechanical affairs. The railway ran through services from London to Edinburgh and Aberdeen, its other two main constituents being the Scottish North British Railway and the North Eastern Railway, whose name said it all. Like the LMS, the LNER could trace its roots back to the earliest days of the railways, in the form of one of the foundation parts of the North Eastern, the legendary Stockton and Darlington Railway, opened in 1825 to haul coal from the Northumberland pits to the outlet to the sea on Teesside. Coal and mineral traffic was vital to the LNER, which wasn't averse to using even the glamorous A1 Pacifics on goods work. The conditions of the 1920s and 30s in the coal market would hit the LNER very hard. Also dependent on the coal industry were the myriad of small railway companies which serviced the coalfields of South Wales. These were to be taken into the fold of the Great Western Railway at the 1923 grouping. The Great Western was different to the two northern companies, as it was already the product of amalgamations in the Victorian era. The 1923 acquisitions made little impact upon it, and it took pride in its continuity. As always in the railway world, the locomotive stock was its public face, and the standardisation policy, which had originated in the 1900s under its legendary locomotive designer George Jackson Churchward, gave it a cohesive appearance which none of the other railways came close to. Taking a train from London to the West Country would have a sense of continuity, even to the branch line train at the end of the journey. Continuous development of its locomotives led to the famous Castle-class express passenger locomotives, with which the Great Western was able to run what was the world's fastest train. This was the Cheltenham Flyer, whose schedule from Swindon to Paddington over Brunel's incomparable main line was cut almost annually in the 1920s, until it averaged over 70 miles an hour for the first time anywhere in the world. The Castles were used on this train even after the introduction of the famous King class, which were the most powerful locomotives in the country at the time of their introduction in 1927. The Great Western was a leader in advanced working practices and safety. As early as 1905, it introduced an in-cab signalling system known as automatic train control, or ATC. By the time of grouping, it had been extended to all its main lines, and this publicity film describes its functions.
This invention is called the automatic train control and makes travelling much safer. It also avoids much delay during foggy weather. When the signals are at danger, the siren blows thus. Which automatically brings the train to a standstill. When the signals are in the all right position, the bell rings thus. Both the siren and the bell are worked by a shoe fitted to the engine, which comes in contact with a ramp fixed to the permanent way. Whoa!
The smallest of the big four was the Southern Railway, formed by the amalgamation of three rival but essentially separate concerns, together with many smaller lines. The three rivals were the South Eastern and Chatham, the London, Brighton and South Coast, and the London and South Western Railways. All had comparatively short main lines serving the South Coast, and all were primarily passenger carrying companies. Only the South Western had a reasonably long main line, to Exeter and through Devon into Cornwall, where it competed with the Great Western. For this traffic, it had developed comfortable passenger trains, the principal one of which was named the Atlantic Coast Express, or ACE, a notable public relations exercise by the Southern Railway. The main steam express locomotives, not in themselves particularly spectacular, were given the names of Knights of the Round Table as the King Arthur class, and achieved some measure of glamour as a result. The Southern didn't handle anything like as much goods traffic as the other three of the big four, so had rather different problems to face. All three of its main constituents had developed intensive suburban branch line networks on the south side of London, contributing in no small measure to the extraordinary growth that the capital city had seen since Victorian days. Before the outbreak of the First World War, all had looked at electrifying the suburban services in a bid to combat the growth of tram and bus competition. The Southern was to take this further, as it also had to compete with the growth of private motor cars and taxis in the post-war world. The Brighton and South Western companies had electrified some routes before and during the war on different systems, so the Southern had to decide on a single standard one for its expansion of electric services. The South Western's third rail DC traction was adopted for future use, and the Brighton's overhead electrics were converted to this by the Southern. The South Eastern and Chatham, in a poor financial state, had not been able to do anything, so the Southern was faced with an urgent requirement on the lines of that company, installing third rail electrics during the 1920s. By the end of the 1920s, most of the suburban routes were electrified, and the Southern electric system had a very high public profile. It was seen as different to the other railways and didn't suffer from the effects of the downturn in freight traffic. It was in many ways the most innovative and forward-thinking of the companies, its promotion of electrification still making use of indigenous supplies of coal, merely burning it at power stations rather than on board its locomotives. Main line electrification was instituted in 1933, when the Brighton Main Line, seen here, was turned over to electric traction. The so-called Sparks effect was immediate, passenger numbers on this line alone increasing by over 500,000 in 1933 itself, a year in which the Southern increased its passenger revenue by £321,000 against the general trend in a period of austerity following the Depression. Mainline electrification was further extended in the 1930s along the coast to Hastings, and the longest so far to Portsmouth from Waterloo. More was planned, and the Southern envisaged complete electrification of its system in the years ahead. Because of this policy, steam locomotive development was seen as something of a secondary concern. As the juice rails were laid down, existing steam locomotives would be displaced to those parts of the system which had no electrics. Most notably, the suburban tank engines dating from the last years of the 19th century were displaced to branch lines, especially in the West Country, which would be the last part of the railway to be electrified. However, new steam locomotives would still be needed for some services, and especially for the long-distance trains which were getting heavier. The King Arthurs were the mainstay of the express passenger services to Devon and Cornwall and to Southampton and Bournemouth. By 1927 more powerful ones yet were required, and the Lord Nelson class were built to haul 500-ton trains at an average speed of 55 miles an hour. This specification was drawn up to cope with boat trains to service the cross-channel traffic, which was seen to be a major and prestigious source of revenue for the Southern Railway. The Southern was very aware of the value of publicity and produced some brilliant coups with the naming of some of its trains, such as the Golden Arrow and Night Ferry services, which ran to the Channel ports and were the principal links between London and the continent between the wars. Both ran from the eastern part of London Victoria Station, which had been built by the London, Chatham and Dover Railway as a joint venture with the Brighton Company in 1860. These were the services for which the Lord Nelsons were specified, and this is Lord Nelson, arriving at Victoria in the early 1930s. Completion of the Chatham Company's route into Victoria had led to what was known as the feud between it and the South Eastern Railway in the last quarter of the 19th century, when many duplicate routes to Kentish towns of any importance reduced both companies to near penury. They united in 1899 and attempted to right matters, but remained poor right up to grouping. However, their legacy was of immense benefit to the nation. During the First World War, the myriad of additional routes enabled the British Army in the trenches of Flanders to be supplied and for troop movements to be scheduled at far greater frequencies than would have been the case with a simpler system. The duplicate routes had also helped in the massive expansion of the capital as mentioned earlier. The principal traffic over which they had fought was the continental traffic, especially the lucrative post office contracts. With the increase in mobility and recreation in the post-war world, the new Southern Railway found it needed the alternative routes to operate successful boat trains, which, by their very nature and the effect of tidal shifts, were frequently delayed. One curious feature of the boat trains was the retention of three classes of travel long after second class had been abolished elsewhere in Great Britain. This was to enable through booking to the continent, where three classes were still common. The very nature of these boat trains saw the use of Pullman coaches amongst ordinary stock, and the Golden Arrow was made up exclusively of Pullman stock. Another southern innovation was the night ferry, Britain's first international passenger train. Services commenced on the evening of the 14th of October 1936 and offered overnight sleeping car services between London and Paris, with the coaches being taken across the Channel on a specially equipped cross-channel ferry with railway tracks on board. This is the official film of the launch of the service. The Southern wasn't the only innovative railway company. In 1933, as an attempt to reduce the costs of running little-used rural services, the LNER experimented with diesel railcars from Armstrong Whitworth and followed them up with a lightweight rail bus the following year. The latter is explained here by a company spokesman.
This is the new Armstrong Whitworth diesel-electric rail bus, the first of its type to be built. It brings to the inhabitants of the country towns and villages the advantages of an electrified railway. It allows the railway companies to compete with road traffic and provide a service of light trains at frequent intervals.
These diesel railcars were amongst the first on Britain's railways. The LMS had one, and the Great Western introduced the first of its railcars shortly thereafter, the numbers of which would swell to a total of 38 vehicles before the Second World War broke out. However, the 4 LNER vehicles didn't survive even until then, this one being withdrawn in February 1939 and the remainder during that year. They weren't the only experiments with alternatives to steam by the Big Four. Diesel power was also seen to be useful for shunting locomotives, and all built small numbers of these. Like the Southern, the LNER was also an exponent of electrification, using it for suburban services in London and Newcastle areas. It had inherited the latter from the North Eastern Railway, which had electrified its Newcastle suburban services as early as 1904, and intended to electrify part of the East Coast Main Line in the 1920s. It had started by wiring part of the original Stockton and Darlington line from Shildon during the First World War on the 1500-volt DC overhead system for freight use only. Following a massive downturn in the coal traffic, the LNER dismantled this in 1935, storing the locomotives for possible use on its project to electrify the old Great Central route through the Pennines via Woodhead. This was started in the late 1930s but suspended due to the war, so its story really belongs to the BR era. However, the LNER produced this single prototype electric locomotive in 1941. However, most locomotive development in the 1930s continued to be with steam. In 1932, William Stanier became the chief mechanical engineer of the LMS and set about the modernisation of that company's locomotive stock, which had been so woefully served in the Fowler years. His first completely new locomotive design, completed in June 1933, was an indication of where LMS locomotive development was now heading. This was 6200, the Princess Royal, a large modern express passenger locomotive. At last the LMS had something to shout about, and the newsreels soon responded.
This is Britain's most powerfulest engine, built by the London, Midland and Scottish Railway for hauling the heavy Scots trains between Euston and Glasgow.
It is the maiden journey of the new locomotive on the LMS Scottish Run. The engine has been named after Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal, and she is expected to break all records.
Unfortunately, this press run met with a technical hitch. The locomotive failed at Lichfield with a hot bearing, but the newsreels in those days only emphasised the positive aspects of the new order. Initially, only 2 of these Princess Royal class locomotives were built, plus one experimental steam turbine version. Series production of 10 engines didn't commence for another 2 years. During that time, Stanier produced a number of other designs for the LMS, the first of which were an adaptation of the most successful of the earlier LMS designs, the mixed traffic Crabs, and the first appeared a month before his Princess Royal. However, after just 40 were built, Stanier substituted a brand new design, a 460 mixed traffic type, which would become known as the Black 5. The Black 5 was to become the most common British mixed traffic locomotive of all, and would be seen all over the country until the end of steam. There were many variations on the theme, but they were effectively all one class, totalling 842 examples. They were used on secondary passenger trains and fast freights, and the design was simple and straightforward. They displaced the small Fowler engines, which were reduced to local and light passenger workings. They were particularly welcome on the Scottish lines of the LMS and enabled the company to dispose of many elderly pre-grouping types there. It's said that they could be seen across the country, from Wick to Bournemouth, the latter being reached by the Somerset and Dorset line, on whose severe gradients the Black 5s were an enormous advance on the Fowler ones previously used. Between the construction of the prototype and production batches of the Princess Royals, Stanier introduced a large number of express locomotives known as the Jubilee class. They were a development of the Fowler Patriots, which were themselves a smaller version of the Royal Scots. During the war, all 3 types were to be further developed into a single, more powerful type of express locomotive. The Patriots were the last of the Fowler designs, and only 2 had been built by the time Stanier took over. He inherited an order for 50 more, which were built unchanged, but for further construction he substituted a taper boiler and produced the Jubilees, 191 of which were turned out. But they just wouldn't steam well. Even this late in the development of the steam locomotive, some things were little understood. The Jubilees were 3-cylinder machines with 6 exhaust beats per revolution. 2 or 4-cylinder locomotives had 4 exhausts per revolution. Only after prolonged experimentation was it realised that 3-cylinder locomotives needed a different exhaust blast pipe to get sufficient draw on the fire, and after this was done, the Jubilees became the success that the LMS desperately needed. Speed, and the streamlining to achieve it, was the buzzword of the 1930s, especially on the railways. The Germans were first in the field, trying to wrench the world's speed record from the British with this machine, the first of a pair. The first authentic 100 miles an hour had been recorded by the immortal Flying Scotsman in 1934, but this was just a sweetener for the introduction of Gresley's masterpiece, the streamlined A4 Pacifics. The Streaks.
Latest streamline wonder of the LNER leaves King's Cross on her record-making trial run. Cutting the film to help you get the sense of speed, we take you into the air in a plane itself travelling at over 100 miles an hour.
On this inaugural run of the non-stop Silver Jubilee Express to Newcastle, the first engine of this class, Silver Link, took the speed record up to 112 miles an hour on the 29th of September 1935. A year later, the second of the German streamliners, 05002, took the honours, achieving 124.5 miles an hour on the 11th of May 1936.
This is the type of engine that will work the Coronation Expresses and bring thousands down from the north to take part in the great celebrations.
The LNER wasn't going to stand on its laurels, and it fought back. In 1937, the coronation of King George VI led to the introduction of another streamlined express, this time to Edinburgh, and named the Coronation. Gresley's streamlined Pacifics were once again the power, and the train itself had luxury appointments and, at the rear, an observation car. Even the Great Western got involved with streamlining, in a very lacklustre way, which even the newsreel commentator didn't think much of.
Giant engine, a strange-looking monster with most of its streamlining in the nose. A sort of iron balloon on wheels, but a hot favourite for the railway estates.
However, it was the LMS which next took up the mantle with its streamliner, the Coronation Scott, also introduced in 1937. The locomotive was the first of a new type of LMS Pacific, developed from the Princess Royals. At last, the LMS had some real express passenger locomotives. The press run was an attempt to wrest the British speed record from the LNER, but the commentator took the LMS's figure, which was slightly exaggerated. The real speed was 112.5 miles an hour.
The result is the record with a top speed of 114 miles per hour.
A year later, the LMS, now really getting into the PR game, celebrated its centenary, actually that of the London and Birmingham Railway, and once again wheeled out Lion. However, this spectacle was eclipsed by the LNER, whose famous Mallard captured the all-time world steam record in July at 126 miles an hour.
Speed was raised to 60 by the Coronation engine of 1911, but today over 100 miles an hour is possible, and it's London to Glasgow in 6.5 hours.
So they should be interested in the LMS centenary. The Lion, itself 100 years old, gets steam up at Euston. In the driving cab are Lord Stamp, chairman of the LMS, the Mayor of St Pancras and the Lord Mayor of Birmingham. The line started as the London to Birmingham Railway, driven by boodles or beavers. Men were men in those days. A 100 years of letting off steam have made our stations what they are, but the Lion's all right and can still do 30 miles an hour, in horizontal direction, of course. Following is the Duchess of Gloucester, a streamlined 20th century model. The drivers of the Lion get back on schedule all right just before they open. The Coronation Scott is fitted with a bell to conform with American regulations. It's to make an exhibition tour of the States. Driver Bishop and fireman Carswell, who are going with it, are wished good luck by Lord Stamp.
Well, goodbye, Bishop. You've had plenty of good advice, so I won't give you any more. But you're going over and we know you'll uphold the credit of Britain and British Railways.
The train will shortly leave Southampton for its journey across the Atlantic. On the other side, a tour will be made embracing over 3,000 miles and 38 cities. Americans will be able to compare the efficiency and luxurious appointments with those of their trains.
In the following year, the LMS sent a complete Coronation Scott train set to the USA for the 1939 New York World's Fair, With the outbreak of war, it would be marooned there until 1942.
It takes a heavy list, but rights herself again as it swung over the hull. The ship that takes it across, by the way, is Norwegian. The train is going to America to tour the country and to be on show at the World's Fair.
But, despite all this upbeat news, the railway's position at the end of the 1930s was getting pretty desperate. All the strands which we noted earlier were combining at the same time as war clouds started to appear. The railway companies mounted a campaign to get the government to free up their commercial position.
Disturbed by the ominous words, we asked Lord Stamp what it was all about. He told us that there had been a 5 million drop in railway receipts this year. It seems that the terms on which railways operate were fixed 100 years ago, before there was any road transport to challenge their supremacy. Road transport, which has become so efficient in recent years, is not bound by the limitations which Parliament put upon the railway monopoly of those early years. So despite the strenuous efforts made by the railway systems to meet competition, by new rolling stock, improvement of services and acceleration of time schedules on the long runs, they still find themselves handicapped by the regulations devised all those many years ago. Having seen the arrival at Euston of the Coronation Scot, in case you wondered what train it was, we'll have a final word from Lord Stamp.
Our receipts are dropping alarmingly. Matters are urgent. Prosperous railways are essential to prosperous commerce, and therefore to a prosperous nation. They could not be ready to help in wartime if they are weak in peacetime. All we are asking for is a square deal, a fair field and no favour.
Sadly, the politicians had a greater concern in the form of war. Despite Lord Stamp's warning that underfunded railways would be less able to help in wartime, the government soon took them under its control for the duration, a move which would only make matters worse. This took place on the 1st of September 1939, a mere 2 days before war was declared, and was to allow the railways to assemble special trains to assist the military. Dining facilities were stopped almost immediately, and passenger timetables were torn up. Just like in these scenes at Waterloo, masses of people needed to travel on slower and less frequent trains. Service personnel received travel warrants, and railway travel became associated with the order to travel rather than the desire. With blackout conditions enforced, filthy locomotives and carriages, unkempt stations and long, slow journey times, the railways quickly lost their hard-won public appreciation. Right from the outset there were massive queues at all the main London terminals, as it was expected that bombs would shortly be raining down on London from above. Many families were driven to despair as children were evacuated to the country for their safety. Heartbreaking scenes of farewell like these, many families to be split asunder forever, would imprint themselves on young minds, who would, no doubt, never be able to travel by train again without a sense of foreboding. The Southern's inheritance of duplicate routes throughout Kent would once again prove to be of immense benefit during this war, as, although they would suffer the highest number of hits, the alternative lines enabled the railways to continue to function. Some amazing feats of transportation took place, additional trains being required both to take troops and equipment to France in the early stages of the war, and to bring them back again from the Channel ports after the disaster at Dunkirk. Later on, the D-Day landings were to see nearly 3 million people passing through Southampton docks, owned by the Southern, between D-Day and VE Day. All the railways had to coordinate their plans, as military trains tended to pass from one company's metals to the others at odd times and via strange routes. Railway work was seen as essential to the war effort, although it became hard to recruit new staff when able-bodied young men were being drafted. As with many industries, the employment of women was accelerated. Railway maintenance became restricted to an as-required basis, and many older locomotives which would have been withdrawn or scrapped were retained.
This war, more than any other in the history of mankind, is a war of transport. Troops must be carried to their positions to guard Britain and to attack from Britain. And all the weapons of war must be transported with them. The factories which make these weapons must be fed with raw materials and supplied with workers. Keep the lines clear for waging war. Remember, every time you ride in a train, You're using coal that's needed to make the machines of war. Every time you ride in a bus, you're using petrol that's needed to drive these machines. You may not be very big or very heavy, and you may not be going more than a 3 halfpenny ride, but every little counts. So save your fare and save our fuel. And march to victory with the troops.
There were many instances of heroism amongst railway staff. One incident on the line from Ely to Newmarket at Surham Station, winning both driver Ben Gimbert and fireman Jim Knightle the George Cross. Driver Gimbert survived to tell the tale.
Well, Mr. Gimbert, we're all very, very pleased to see you setting up and taking notice so well, and I'm sure everybody's very, very proud of the job you did. What do you think about it?
Well, I think I'm very lucky to be here.
Yes, I think you are too. Would you like to tell us what happened?
Yes, I was working an ammunition train through a little eastern county village, when suddenly looking around I saw the wagon next to the engine on fire. I says to my mate, James Knightle, we'll have to stop and get it unhooked as soon as possible. On bringing my train to a stand, Fireman Knightle unhooked the blazing wagon. We ran ahead to the signal box and I told the signalman to stop all coming trains as I wanted to run and get out in the open with this blazing wagon. And I remember no more till after I was picked up in the rescue.
Well, that certainly was a wonderful experience. A very dreadful experience.
Yes, it was.
It was just bad luck that your fireman lost his life.
Yes, I don't think they can give too high praise for a lad of his age to go and unhook a wagon when it was ablaze like that was.
Yes, well, it's a very, very good job indeed.
Yeah. He was a very brave man. He's an old mate of mine. I've had him with me such a long time that I think that is the biggest trouble, to leave him out of it. I can't say it.
No, well, that's right. I shouldn't. Well, all we want to see now is to get you back on your feet again and get running around. What do you want to do when you come out of here?
Well, that's all I'm longing for, is to get back on the old engine again.
Get back on the old engine,
just to keep the wheels stirred.
That's the spirit. That's the spirit. Good show.
The locomotive from which driver Gimbert was thrown 200 yards was one of a series of heavy goods engines built to an austerity design for the War Department. Many of these would be sent overseas, and many were used on Britain's railways first. They became known as Dub Ds, and were a stripped-down version of the Stanier 8F of the LMS. American locomotives of the S-160 class, one is seen passing the site of the Surham explosion, were also used on Britain's railways for a time, but these were intended to work on the continental railways after D-Day, and were only of use during the build-up to that event. They were amongst the materials loaded at Southampton docks. Some locomotives were transferred between the big four companies, the Southern in particular sending passenger locomotives away, as there was far less need for them due to the reductions in passenger trains. 10 of the original London and South Western Railway members of the N15 or King Arthur class, despite being express passenger locomotives, were sent to the North East from October 1942 until relieved by the American Class S-160s in the middle of 1943. They were stationed at Heaton and worked goods trains to York, Edinburgh, Leeds, Hull and Doncaster, alongside the LNER's own mixed traffic machines. Many locomotives were dubbed the engines that won the war, but that accolade is most frequently associated with the Class V2 Prairies of the LNER. These powerful locomotives were the final mainstream design of the great Nigel Gresley, who had become Sir Nigel Gresley in 1936 when the first V2s appeared. They were a slightly smaller version of his Pacifics, incorporating many of the advances included in the streamlined A4 Pacifics. Construction continued through the war years, number 4868 being built in February 1940, and 184 were built in total. The V2s were designed to haul fast freight services from London to the north and to cover the lesser passenger trains for which the A-class Pacifics were too large. They were the only large class of prairie tender engines to be used in Great Britain, the type having long been a staple of US railroads. It was thought that the single pair of wheels at the front would not be suitable for high-speed running, But Gresley and his team were very much into scientific development of the steam locomotive and designed a special type of suspension which was fully vindicated in service. Their power became legendary, 20-coach trains out of King's Cross being common during the war. On one run, a V2 hauled a 26-coach train unaided from Peterborough to London. Sir Nigel Gresley died in 1942 and was succeeded by Edward Thompson. His appointment was symbolic of the change in the railways which the war effected. He threw over many of the Gresley advances which had made the LNER's locomotive stock the Rolls-Royce of British steam. This was done in the name of simplicity and austerity, watchwords which would resonate in the post-war world where steam locomotives would have to be easily maintained at minimum cost. Perhaps the true symbol of the last part of British steam locomotive history would be the LMS Black 5 class, whose designer William Stanier was, like Gresley, to be knighted in 1943, the year before he retired from the LMS. His successor, Charles Fairbairn, held the position for barely 2 years and was succeeded by George Ivett, a man who, like Thompson, had to build locomotives for a very different world. As our story continues, we'll see how the railways of Britain emerged from the war beaten down and unloved. The fall was precipitous indeed. The railways of Great Britain emerged from the Second World War in a very parlous state. Ahead of them was another struggle for survival, their own, which would test them like no other and require fundamental changes in their ethos and purpose before they could once again rise to become a major transport system for the future. But in 1945, contrary to the celebrations marking the end of wartime austerity, on the railways they were counting the cost, as 6 years of war had left them with a huge maintenance backlog. Assets, especially locomotives, had been driven into the ground, and few new ones had been built. The majority of construction in the war years had been of the austerity types, which were designed for short working lives and, in any event, belonged to the War Department and thus government. Here we see examples at work on the Longmoor Military Railway in Hampshire after the war. The railways themselves had been under government control during the war years and were owed massive sums of money for that use. However, the government had no way of paying them, and the advent of a Labour administration in the post-war general election meant that the railways were now threatened with nationalisation. This swiftly became fact, as not only was it an election manifesto promise, but also a convenient way of avoiding making those payments. Railway company shareholders could be paid by issuing government bonds, and the staff, who were amongst the largest group of union members, could be rewarded for their loyalty by becoming employees of the state rather than greedy capitalists. But nationalisation couldn't take place overnight, and it would be nearly 2.5 years from the election until the promise could be fulfilled, the Big Four railway companies being abolished from the 1st of January 1948, when British Railways came into being. Not all railways in the country were to be absorbed. The famous Liverpool Overhead Railway remained in private hands, as it was self-contained and a purely local concern. However, it had suffered from severe war damage, and its trains were in desperate need of replacement or refurbishment, like the nationalised ones. Opened in 1893, it was the world's first electrically operated elevated railway, and was controlled by automatic electric signals, features which had yet to be adopted on much of the mainline system. Its purpose was to take passenger traffic off the heavily congested traditional railway system which fed the Liverpool docks, and it cost nearly £3.5 million to build. It would cost nearly 100 times that today. It was built and operated by a private company and needed 8 million passengers a year to make a profit, on a line which was only 6 miles long. The trackbed was made of rolled steel sheets to stop any unwanted debris falling upon unsuspecting passers-by or cargo. It provided a welcome shelter from the rain, and hence was nicknamed the Docker's Umbrella by locals. It was soon found that it was only used during working hours, so was extended to residential areas at Dingle and Seaforth Sands, increasing its length to 7 miles. It was profitable from 1897, and its peak carrying was 19 million passengers in 1919. However, it suffered a long decline, starting with changes in the way the docks conducted business. Telephones replaced travelling messengers, larger ships carried more cargo, and so there were fewer messengers. The Liverpool trams were subsidised by Liverpool Corporation with cheaper fares than the overhead and reached more destinations. During the Second World War it was blitzed and repaired at great cost, but as the railway was mainly carried on iron viaducts and iron curved deck plates, it was highly susceptible to corrosion. This was accentuated by the steam-powered dock railway running beneath. After the war the infrastructure was surveyed, and the report was that the line was in need of extensive repairs due to corrosion at a cost of £2 million. The company didn't have the funds needed and tried to obtain support from the corporation. This wasn't forthcoming, so the Liverpool Overhead Railway Company went into voluntary liquidation and closed on the 30th of December 1956 after 63 years of operation. Of the Big Four, the Southern Railway had probably been the biggest victim of the Blitz, its main lines in the southeast being in the front line from the Battle of Britain onwards. Curiously, its Victoria terminus was the victim of huge destruction almost immediately after the war.
In London, poor old Victoria Station has been in the news again. As if it hadn't suffered enough from enemy action during the war, it must now have a serious fire, which did a lot of damage near platform number 1. It's thought to have started from overhead electric cables, and the picture shows clearly what a mess the fire caused in the booking office. Special carriages housing an exhibition of penicillin were got away from platform 1 and saved, but Southern Railway trains were held up all over the place, and as you see, offices in the station were thoroughly wrecked. In fact, Victoria once again looked like the morning after a blitz. This time, however, there were no casualties.
The Southern's plans for electrification of the majority of its network had been severely curtailed by the war. During the middle of the 1920s, it had electrified the majority of its suburban network, and, although slightly slowed by the Great Depression, it had managed to put the juice rails, as the electrical third rail laid alongside the running rails was popularly known, on 3 of its main lines before the outbreak of war, to Brighton and Portsmouth from London, and the coastal lines between the two and on to Hastings. Each would be a starting block for further electrification, with the lines to the Kent coast and to Southampton and Bournemouth the next to be tackled. It also wanted to extend down into the West Country to Exeter. Since this was the main thrust of the Southern Railway's investment plans, there was little incentive, and few funds, to build up or replace the steam locomotive fleet. The intention was to concentrate on electrification, with steam being displaced to those parts which were furthest down the list for electrification. Since this would be completed within 2 decades, the most recent steam types would be reaching the end of their economic life as the electrification programme was completed. The last lines to Maidstone by both routes and to Gillingham had had the 600 volts DC switched on from the 2nd of July 1939. This was just 14 years from the start of southern electrification, but it would be another 20 years before any further extension to the system would take place. Once it had become obvious that war would break out, the southern management had had to revise their plans. The further extensions of these latter schemes to the Kent coast were to have been the next mainline schemes, so if these weren't going to happen, alternative power would be needed. In 1937, Oliver Bulleid took over as chief mechanical engineer from Richard Maunsell and was charged with producing a locomotive capable of speeding up the continental boat expresses. Approval to build 10 such machines was given in 1938, and Bulleid's first merchant navy appeared in 1941. It looked like nothing before it and was full of technical advances, or challenges if you had to work on it. As the war drew on and it was obvious that electrification would be very delayed, a further 10 were ordered to handle the passenger services on the lines to Exeter and Bournemouth. By the time they appeared, the war was won, and they took their turns on the heavy holiday trains of the post-war summers, as seen here climbing Honiton Bank. The Southern had always prided itself on being the holiday line, so it was prepared for the numbers of holidaymakers in those immediate post-war summers. The Devon branch lines, such as Lyme Regis seen here, were as busy as they'd ever been. One of the Southern's many enterprising ventures was a result of a shortage of coaching stock following damage in the war. In 1947, the Southern introduced a new venture in the form of an all-Pullman train to the West Country, named the Devon Belle. The newsreels picked up on its opulence.
Whatever pleasure you can get out of travelling in Britain is twice the fun. We all know what some train journeys are like: stuffy carriages, standing room only, one tunnel after another. So when the port has given a final polish, let's take a ride on Britain's latest train, the Pullman that gives you a window on the world, the Devon Belle. These folks are not only travelling through some of Britain's loveliest countryside, through rolling farmlands to the West Country, but they can see it all in comfort. This is travel as it should be. You can even make faces at those common trains that go by without pricking your neck. Favourite drink on the Devon Belle is called the Spirit of Drake. Drink enough of it and you'll see 4 times as well. How to see England. This is travel on the right tracks.
Another use of Pullmans was in ordinary trains. Again, it was on the Southern.
Refreshment cars are back, with a difference. The Southern Railway has converted them into travelling snack bars. And by bars, I really mean bars. The snacks are available too, of course, and altogether the journey to Hastings, on which the first of these modern services is running, is going to be a jollier and more sociable business. Incidentally, there's going to be no discrimination between classes of ticket holders, so third and first class travellers needn't look suspiciously or even defiantly at one another over this new improvement for passengers. Good old Southern.
However, all this publicity didn't really make much difference to normal services, which was still virtually the same as before the war. The Southern still had its inheritance of older locomotive types for the majority of services, its make-do-and-mend attitude to steam having been most obvious in the case of the Remembrance class, which had been built by the Brighton Company before grouping as large Baltic tank engines. They had been the principal express locomotives of that railway until the Southern electrified the Brighton Main Line in 1933. Effectively obsolete, yet still quite modern, the 6 locomotives of the class weren't really suitable for use elsewhere. So an ingenious solution was devised, a perfect example of the Southern ethos, to rebuild them as conventional tender engines for use on the former London and South Western Railway main lines out of Waterloo to the west of England and Southampton and Bournemouth, which were, even at that time, seen as the last group of lines to be electrified. The reasoning was that these conversions would have a useful life of around 15 years, by which time these lines would have been tackled. In the event, as we've seen, no more electrification took place after 1939, so these engines emerged after the war still doing the same work, and doing so for another 10 years after that, when they were really ready for retirement. The same applied to other steam locomotive types built in the early part of the Southern's existence, and of course to steam locomotives of the other three of the Big Four. However, it was the Southern which was to be faced with the biggest problem. What had been intended as its final type of express steam locomotive, before the revision of its plans which led to the Bulleid Pacifics which we've already seen, was the Schools class, the most powerful four-coupled engine in Europe, and intended for lighter but fast expresses. They were best known for work on the London to Hastings line, which had been slated for electrification by the Southern, but would be delayed by nearly 40 years. Wartime austerity meant that most locomotives were plain black by the end. The Southern had tried to brighten that colour up with its sunshine lettering, but it wasn't until the following year that it could start repainting its fleet in a bright green, a colour known as malachite green, once again, starting with the express locomotives including Blundell's, one of that Schools class. The coaches were also brightened by a lighter shade of green than before, a welcome splash of colour in the austere post-war world. The new Southern chief engineer, Oliver Bulleid, was also in charge of coaching stock design, and although the priority was for new electric trains, locomotive hauled coaches were also vital. He designed a new range of coaches which were far more advanced than hitherto, and which were mass-produced for the first 6 years after the end of the war. Here we see a pair of them arriving at Sherborne in Dorset. Looking to the Southern's long-term motive power requirements as a result of the investment hold-up, Bulleid was instrumental in the design of a mainline diesel locomotive, but was pipped to the post by George Ivett of the LMS. Number 10,000 was completed a matter of days before the end of the LMS itself, being rolled out at Euston in December 1947.
Derby London line, number 10,000 is the only engine of its type in service. It develops 1,600 horsepower and a top speed of 93 miles an hour. On this run, it's pulling a train of 400 tons. Smokeless and grime-free, the driver's cabin's as trim as a parlour. The driver sits at a dashboard and employs a master key attached to a control tower. Braking is done by foot. Quick acceleration is the secret of its phenomenal performance.
It wouldn't wear those bright, shiny letters LMS for long. On the 1st of January 1948, British Railways came into being. LMS, LNER, GWR and SR would no longer rule the rails. The new company had inherited more than 20,000 steam locomotives, a handful of electric locomotives, a few diesel shunters and one mainline diesel locomotive. The first priority was to incorporate them all into one fleet. Renumbering would cause chaos, so the time-honoured system of adding a prefix was used. GW engines retained their existing numbers. Diesels were in the 10,000 range, electrics 20,000, Southern engines had 30,000 added, LMS 40,000 and the LNER 60,000. BR's own designs would later use the 70,000 to 90,000 range. The question of liveries then lifted its head. The new man in charge of locomotive affairs, he wasn't given the traditional CME title, was Robin Riddles, and he set up what was known as the Beauty Parade of locomotives for the members of the British Railways Board to view in order to decide. Riddles was an ex-LMS man, and his team was mostly drawn from that massive company. For the viewing, some ex-LMS locomotives were repainted in a variety of colours based on those of the old companies. It was generally agreed that plain black would be used for freight engines and blue for the main express engines. Secondary express engines would be a dark green. However, controversy raged over the colours for mixed traffic engines, but after the parade it was decided to go with black lined out in red, cream and grey, the colours of the old London and North Western Railway, the largest constituent part of the LMS. Coaches were also subjected to some experimental colour schemes, but the first choice was crimson red with cream, a colour that had no associations with any of the Big Four or their forebears, and it was generally considered to be very successful. The blue for express locomotives wasn't a success as it faded badly, so it was decided to extend the secondary dark green to all express locomotives. This looked superb on the ex-GWR Kings, which wasn't really surprising, as a dark green adopted by BR was the old GWR dark green in any event. After a while of spelling the name British Railways out in full-on tenders or tank size, an emblem was designed and applied to locomotives in its stead. This became known as the Cycling Lion. Designing new locomotives and rolling stock for the new state railway system would take some considerable time, and the first priority was to decide what form these should take. Before the war, on the continent there had been a massive programme of electrification, and this was being continued as those railways, which had suffered far more damage than the British system, were rebuilt. In Britain, electrification had been seen as the way ahead, but except on the southern, little progress had been made. The start-again philosophy on the continental railways wasn't possible here, so a period of trial was considered the best way forward. This took the form of the completion of the LNER's suspended project to electrify the Woodhead route through the Pennines, and this became the flagship project of the British Railways Board in its early days. It would take until 1954 to complete the work, just a year before it was effectively declared obsolete, when it was announced that all future electrification, except that on the southern region, would be at 25 kilovolts AC. But that was the future. What was needed was a stopgap policy to update the railway's locomotive stock as soon as possible. Initially, the British Railways Board decided to continue to build locomotives to the designs of the Big Four, such as the LMS Black 5s. In total, 1,538 locomotives would be built to these pre-nationalisation designs over the next 8 years. At the same time, the locomotive design team prepared specifications for a range of standard locomotives for future construction. A range of 12 to cover all types of work was drawn up. Some of these were simply mild reworks of some of the LMS designs, but the first of these to be built was the Class 7 Pacific, a completely new design, a prototype of which was unveiled to the world in 1951, 3 years after the formation of British Railways.
Loco number 70,000 is ready for service. It's the first of the new standard locomotives, so the Minister of Transport, Mr. Alfred Barnes, gives it a name and his blessing. Suitable for express passenger or fast goods trains, the new standards include the best ideas from the pre-nationalisation types. It's the first of 25 now under construction at Crewe. But when they're all standard, isn't life going to be dull for those who love the old giants of the Iron Road?
Britannia was born into a new world, a world that was turning its back on the railways, a world in which the road vehicle was the politicians' favoured form of transport. Where the publicity films had been about railways previously, now it was just transport.
By day and by night, the wheels are turning. For transport, by its nature, is never still. Transport crosses the lonely stretches, so that people and things may meet where they should. Transport brings the raw materials, takes away the finished goods. A trawler's catch or a birthday letter, steel for a ship or a friend for Christmas. Transport delivers the goods. Transport means people. By them and for them, the wheels are made to turn. All through the day and on through the night, so that a world may live when it wakes.
Well, to a transport worker, that's just the end of another shift in sight. Maybe you're coming down that last bit of bypass, or shutting off steam for the run-in. Anyway, the feeling's much the same. I know because I've had it many a time. The night's behind you, and rain or shine, the morning looks all right. You're looking forward to signing off, getting the grit out of your hair, and a nice plate of bacon and eggs. If you want to look at this thing called transport, you still can't do better than come to Britain. It was our grandfathers who gave it to the world. Now we're trying something new again. And thereby hangs a tale. You can always tell if a transport worker's happy by the way he binds. They criticize, they grumble, they say you can have it. But you try taking it away.
Ordinary men who see that wheels discharge their obligation. Skill, integrity, and a way with metal. With them, disputes and arguments never threaten safety, for that depends on the best there is in men, beyond creed or difference. Confidence and courage, that is their heritage from the country that bred them. A small country with a long history that has thereby had time to give much to the world. In the 19th century, Britain was turned into a land of iron and steel, sweat and riches, prolific energy and trade. And transport? That which had sufficed since Roman days was hopelessly inadequate. Coaching roads and rutted lanes, turnpikes and tolls, such things were fast outmoded. They built new roads to link the factories and cobbled ways to take the heavier loads. They dug canals, created a web of waterways. Barely was it done when they invented something new. Iron and steam had come together to make things move on wheels. A spate of British railway building astonished the world. 120 separate companies in one small island. A century of pioneering with the sky the limit, and transport kept pace. To meet the needs of factories and trade, to carry our country's newfound greatness to far horizons, modern transport was born. Line upon line, main lines, branch lines, loop lines, junction upon junction, network upon network. They laid the tracks and bored the tunnels, laid more tracks and dug the cuttings, raised the viaducts and crossed the waters in their path. They leapt the Menai Strait, bridged the Tamar, and spanned the Firth of Forth. Mighty achievement that was an inspiration for the world.
It was achievement, all right. The trouble was that often there were too many achievements all in the same place. Take my part of the world. It was a question of getting coal to Leicester. Not many miles outside the town, Leicester had coal mines of her own. At first, the only transport was pack horses. Now, north of Leicester, Nottingham had some coal mines too. What's more, she thought it wouldn't be a bad idea to sell some of it in Leicester. So, out for business, she nipped in with a canal. That did for the pack horses. Leicester, quick to get the point, answered with a canal of her own. Within 2 years, it was useless. I think it was built by a Nottingham firm, but I don't suppose that had anything to do with it. Anyway, then Leicester, really roused, built a railway. That did the Nottingham Canal a bit of no good. Now it was Nottingham's turn, with another railway. It must have been cheap in them days. And there you are. 2 canals and 2 railways, all to do one job. And what was the result of that sort of thing up and down the country? Well, you can still see it today.
It was enterprise, but it was costly. Disused relics designed for movement, for transport, and the vitality it brings. Now they lie empty of life, left behind in a race that moved too fast.
Sadly, some of the claims in that film were a little over the top. Not all transport workers were happy. As a result of the investment famine, many 1930s practices hadn't been updated. For example, the lack of decent accommodation for engine crews working on lodging turns, where they would take a train one way only, staying overnight at the destination, caused a dispute with East Coast Main Line crews.
Unused railway tracks. That's the picture on Whit Sunday when drivers and firemen continued their protest strike against new lodging terms. Locomotives piled up in the yards, and the confusion, of course, spread to the whole railway timetable in regions affected. King's Cross Terminus was a scene of desolation. Special notices were used to cope with the situation. One or two trains which did leave proved that there were some drivers not in sympathy with the strike. Here's one man's opinion.
I've been a driver on the job for practically 20 years. I consider the lodging job better than what they used to be. I consider this strike was not justified, as it's letting the country down and also the public down. It's essentially the job should be worked, and I consider this never ought to have happened. And it could have been avoided if the men had gone the right way about it.
Objection is taken by the strikers to the hostels in which men are lodged on long-distance hauls. It's said that there are 96 men involved. The railway executive claims, however, that accommodation is quite good. This hostel at Kentish Town has figured in the dispute. At least the beds seem to be comfortable.
The East Coast locomotive men were the elite of their time. Before the war, the LNER had created an image of style and speed through its promotion of the streamlined trains powered by Sir Nigel Gresley's Class A4 Pacifics, and one of these, Mallard, had secured the world's speed record for steam shortly before war broke out. In the straitened circumstances of the post-war railway world, there was no opportunity to reinstate the cracked streamliners, as maintenance backlogs meant that few stretches even of main lines were suitable for high-speed running. Nevertheless, British Railways was to reinstate a non-stop service from London to Edinburgh in 1949 as the Capitals Limited, a train which had the same streamlined A4 Pacifics at the head but had no observation car, no hairdressing salon, no cocktail bar and none of the pizzazz of the pre-war streamliners. It took 7 hours 40 minutes to reach the Scottish capital compared to the 6 hours flat of the pre-war train and 7 hours 45 minutes of the Scotch Express of 1888. Nevertheless, it was a first, if tentative, step on the road to service improvements, and over the next few years, as the maintenance backlog was slowly eliminated, the train was gradually speeded up, and in another coronation year, 1953, renamed to celebrate that event. Sadly, the enigmatic coronation name wasn't reused, but the train became the Elizabethan. These views show the new train at York, where the signalling was due for renewal. British Railways was desperate for good news stories, so the completion of the re-signalling here, instigated by the LNER and once again held up by the war, was the subject of a contemporary documentary.
Passengers for York, long brought safely in by the men who handled the 867 levers controlling the lines into the city, now finish their journey in charge of the largest route relay interlocking scheme in the world. Completed at a cost of more than $500,000, the new all-electric finger and thumb operated system does the work of 8 of the old-style boxes. The turn of a switch works the signals and sets the route. Diagrams using 5,000 lights show the position of all trains on 33 miles of track. The panel consists of 827 routes by means of 74 sets of signals and 157 sets of points. Above the diagram is the traffic register, which shows the position at the 16 platforms and the sidings of York Station. With the new system, Northeastern Region achieves economy and safety and steps up speed in transport.
A similar story came from Waterloo.
This week's information story comes from Waterloo Station. At the peak hour, 7 trains leave or arrive here every 5 minutes. Behind their safe journey in or out of the station lies a complicated system centred in Waterloo's signal box. On a coloured panel are shown the track circuits within 2 1/4 miles. Every train is indicated, the exact position shown and its progress charted. 309 signal levers control all the rolling stock within the area. When a train nears, the lever is released and locked. The relay box goes down, the line is signalled clear and the train can pass through. As another train is due in, the signal levers are released and pass current to the relay box, which in turn operates the points mechanism. A daily check on the relay panel ensures that everything goes off without a hitch. This is the other side of the main indicator panel. Maintenance mechanics are on duty 24 hours a day to keep it in smooth working order. An all-electric box, Waterloo signal controls, number nearly 200. On the men in the box rests a heavy responsibility measured in human lives. Theirs is a backroom job, the vital link in daily guiding 1,200 trains to Waterloo's platforms.
Following the war, there was a final fling in the 1950s for the transatlantic liner business from Southampton. Boat trains to and from Waterloo had always been a major part of the Southern's traffic, and the rivalry for the blue riband between the Great Cunarder Queens and the new United States meant that these became very high profile. The Southern Railway and its successor under British Railways, the Southern Region, kept special trains for this traffic, and the latter was to dedicate the members of Richard Maunsell's Lord Nelson class, with their fine seafaring names, to this traffic. Since shipping is subject to the state of the tide, trains could be required at almost any time of day, and queue timetables, queue for as required, had to be scheduled. Crossing the Atlantic by aircraft wasn't yet an everyday affair, and when the royal children went abroad or the Prime Minister Winston Churchill went to the USA, it was by ocean liner. A major legacy of the Southern Railway was its great port at Southampton and the new ocean terminal where the Prince and Princess would embark and where the Great War leader would be welcomed back by the press.
Prince Charles and Princess Anne, who began theirs at Waterloo Station. In a special coach on a holiday relief train, they left for Southampton to board the Royal Yacht Britannia for a tour of the Western Isles with their parents.
The liner Queen Mary is in the news because she's just brought home Mr. Churchill from his visit to America and his holiday in Jamaica. The Prime Minister was looking well and cheerful. As he came ashore at Southampton, he paused at our mic long enough to give this brief summing up.
Here we are again, after a very pleasant voyage, and after an agreeable change in most salubrious surroundings.
Having crossed the Atlantic in one famous Cunarder, Mr. Churchill now completed the journey home in another. The Queen Elizabeth has been in the news for less agreeable reasons. The giant liner has been undergoing an extensive overhaul, and 2 outbreaks of fire on board have been reported. Both were quickly dealt with, but coming so soon after the burning of the Empress of Canada at Liverpool, it was natural that the possibility of sabotage should be investigated.
The other major port bequeathed to the British Transport Commission by the Southern Railway was Dover, to which the famous Golden Arrow service was restored after the war. The train was initially hauled by members of Bulleid's post-war Light Pacifics or West Country and Battle of Britain classes. These were built continuously until 1951, and 110 were built in total, making them the most numerous class of Pacifics in Great Britain. Calstock, seen arriving at Dover Marine Station in 1950, was completed in February that year at Eastleigh, one of the final batch of these engines. The building of so many of these large engines was to cause some controversy in the press at this time, as some members of the class working on the lines west of Exeter were used to haul trains of just 1 or 2 coaches. This was seen as an extravagance and came at a time when the general message was that the railways were very hard-pressed for investment. It was, of course, the product of the revision of the electrification plans and the need to build more steam engines for the Southern Railway. But Bulleid was always controversial. Another of his projects would cause letters to be written to the Times, the tavern cars.
The local takes to wheels as Britain's nationalised railways open the first travelling taverns. With oak beams, settees, and that oldie-worldy atmosphere, the tired businessman can in future pretend he'd already in the country pub. An extra attraction, no licensing hours. The railways simultaneously step up dining comfort for the travellers. Previously accustomed to an ounce of soot with every meal, diners can from now on be assured of 4-star hotel efficiency.
Bullied also produced some strange double-decker suburban trains.
The bus train takes to the rails. At London's Charing Cross, Britain's first double-decker train is sent on its way by Mr. Morrison and given an approving once-over by its drivers of tomorrow. For its maiden journey, this all-British-built train has distinguished company, Transport Minister Alfred Barnes and the Lord President, himself a frequent traveller on this Dartford line. The first verdict on the newcomer is favourable. With seating capacity increased by nearly 50%, the down and up compartments will ease rush hour problems up and down the lines. The two-decker and its passengers are given a civic reception at Dartford, journey's end. They say it's nice travelling upstairs, but you'll duck when you come to the bridges.
However, innovation wasn't confined to the southern. The western region, inheriting the Great Western's individualism, ordered 2 gas turbine prototypes. This, the second, came from Metropolitan Vickers, but it wasn't a success. It had no diesels on order, so the Western showed off its real pride and joys to the future Queen in 1950. It's said the Queen has a fondness for steam trains. Was this where it all began?
Swindon, celebrating the Jubilee of the Borough, gave a royal welcome to Princess Elizabeth. A visit to the railway works was one item on an extensive programme, and here Her Royal Highness watched the casting of her own name and evidently found it rather fascinating. She christened a new engine, and boarding the footplate of another, she herself drove it from the sheds to the platform.
The Western was proud of its traditions and continuity. As we've seen, the reverse was the case on the Southern, where, despite the advent of anything but traditional Bullied Pacifics, much of the locomotive fleet was old and worn out. Many of the Drummond locomotives dating from the turn of the century needed replacement, and this would come in the form of the new standard designs. In order to incorporate the best from all the constituent railways designs, British Railways engineers instituted a series of locomotive testing at the new test plant at Rugby, which had been one of Sir Nigel Gresley's pet projects, delayed by the war. The locomotive bearing his name was the first to go through its paces.
The aim is now for greater speed still. At the newly completed Rugby testing station, the latest type of roller bench is used as a stationary test bed. Capable of recording speeds of up to 130 miles an hour, the plant's main function is to improve existing methods for fuel saving. In the instrument room, a complicated panel of dials records all speed and lubrication data. With equipment costing more than £200,000, Rugby's loco testing station is one of the scientific marvels of the age.
The testing plant opened in 1948, and the design of the new standard locomotives started shortly thereafter. Amongst the 12 types were 2 intermediate mixed traffic Class 4 designs, both of which were used on the southern region on the duties previously handled by the Victorian Drummond machines. These were to prove very successful until the electrification programme could be reinstated. One type of locomotive not included in the standard steam fleet was a shunter. For these duties, the board decided diesel shunters were required. In addition, other modern ideas were being tried out, at last, to attempt to reduce the labour costs which were crippling the railways.
To the railway's signal boxes comes the radio, not to play music while you shunt, but as an aid to marshalling. At Whitemoor Yards, uncoupling orders are now given over the air.
Eastern Whitemoor to Shunt Baker. When you're finished in 23, George, you will go into 22.
Over.
Your message received and understood. Listening out.
Bringing about a much quicker turnaround, radio control is a must in combating the railway's oldest enemy, the fog. Up to now, old-fashioned hand-placed detonators have been fighting a lone battle. Soon, all trains may be linked by radio with signal boxes. Experiments at this, the biggest goods yard in Britain, have been completely successful. One day, perhaps, all trains may come in on time. That is, if they don't get their wavelengths mixed up.
The same standard engines seen on the southern region were also used in Scotland. Standardisation was becoming a reality. Of the 12 standard types amounting to 999 individual locomotives, only one was built to the Class 8P Express passenger specification, and that was to replace one of the LMS's Stania Pacifics, which was destroyed in the worst post-war disaster to hit British Railways.
Three trains were involved in the appalling railway disaster at Harrow and Wealdstone. Each was full of people, and the station was also crowded, with the result that British Railways have suffered their worst accident. The clock stopped at the time of the crash. While the Tring to Euston train was standing in the station, the night express from Perth ran into it, causing fearful damage and chaos. Then the Euston to Manchester express collided with the wreckage from the first collision. The scene has been described by an eyewitness as being like a battlefield. Certainly no exaggeration, for casualties were on a terrible scale. Bandages were hastily improvised on the spot, and everything possible was done by all present to rescue and aid the injured. It was a grim and difficult task in the dreadful conditions prevailing. American troops from a nearby headquarters were quickly on the spot with invaluable blood plasma, but many of the injured were trapped in the wreckage. Their number could not yet be computed, nor was it known at this time how many had lost their lives in the tragedy. One thing, however, was already certain: the disaster was very great, the casualties very large in number.
112 people died and 340 were injured in this most ghastly accident. The cause was never ascertained, as the crew of the overnight sleeper were amongst those who perished.
The whole country was shocked by the news, and everywhere the deepest sympathy was felt and expressed for the bereaved and for all who had been hurt.
The accident would probably not have happened if an automatic warning system had been in use. At the time, only the Western region had fitted it, from as far back as 1905. The accident accelerated British Railways' plans to install such a system nationwide, but there was a massive funding crisis for the British Railways Board. The MGA sports car was first produced in 1955, a propitious year for the railways of Great Britain. In that year, the railways' income failed to cover operating costs for the first time, and this alerted the government to the crisis which was swamping the nationalised business. The truth was that the railways were falling behind the times. Outdated working practices in an environment that had barely changed since the 19th century was not a recipe for recruitment. The workforce could see that their rates of pay and working conditions no longer stood up to comparison with modern alternatives. Trains were dirty, partly because of the recruitment problem, as it was particularly difficult to hire young people to clean locomotives or carriages at all hours of the day when they could get a comfortable 9-to-5 job elsewhere. Furthermore, the ethos of a job for life, such as that offered by the railways, was beginning to break down, and young people had had enough of a regimented existence during national service. To the post-war generation, a new job in the growing road sector was preferable, and the availability of motor vehicles to all parts of society gave greater personal mobility. The general public would still go on annual holidays by train, but day trips were now by bus. Already alienated by the conditions of the railways in the war years and their seeming inability, despite all the positive images that the newsreels put out, to clean themselves up, they were taking to the alternatives provided by the roads. In political terms, the governments since the war had given little support to the railways. The post-war Labour government's declaration that the railways would have access upon nationalisation to all the resources of government for funding had proven hollow, and the change to a Conservative administration in 1951, whose priorities were for private enterprise rather than nationalised industries, further undermined the railway's position. The separation of the various forms of transport into separate businesses was a further blow, emphasised in 1954 when the government decided that British road services were to be denationalised, thus giving the green light to the growth of the road haulage industry, which would abstract business from the railways at an even more alarming rate than before. This was brought into effect on the 1st of January 1955, so the midpoint of the 1950s was the critical point for the railways, now losing money and their traditional role at an alarming rate. Something had to be done. The railways had to be modernised, and even the government realised that. The railways were in crisis, even though they were trying to move forward. But it was outside events which would dictate their future. By the middle of the 1950s, the railways of Great Britain were falling into what seemed to be a bottomless pit. On the surface all seemed to be well. Little trains still ran on charming branch lines throughout the country, like this one to Looe in Cornwall, and it seemed that the railways were a permanent fixture in the life of these islands. But as they entered the second half of the 20th century, their revenues plummeted and costs increased steeply. Now owned and controlled by the government following nationalisation in 1948, they had no commercial freedom and no ways of raising capital except by government funding. Since 1939, the railways have been on the back foot. Starved of money, they still have many examples of obsolete practices and an excessive dependence on manual labour. By the mid-1950s, they were the last major business to use horses, both for their road and railway operations. Horses were still used for shunting in some goods yards. Hampered by the ancient Parliament-imposed requirement to act as common carriers, the railways had to accept any freight offered to them at controlled rates. The charge for a passenger journey was fixed on a per-mile rate, also by parliamentary decree, so the only way to increase income was to carry more freight and more passengers. In their independent days, the railway companies had diversified into other forms of transport, aircraft, shipping, road haulage and buses, entering into financial agreements with other operators and thus having some control over the whole distribution chain. The nationalisation of transport in Great Britain had divided these other arms of the railways into separate businesses within the overall remit of the British Transport Commission. But a change of government a mere 3 years into the new regime meant that private enterprise was the favoured form of business from 1951 onwards, and the railway's former subsidiaries had become its business rivals. The 1953 Transport Act gave this Conservative government powers to denationalise the road transport business it owned, which would open the floodgates of intense competition. The railways were hemorrhaging money. Railway signalling was extremely labour-intensive, and there were signal boxes at almost every station, fully staffed even on lines which had just 1 or 2 trains a day. Attempts were being made to reduce these costs, and in 1953 a number of extremely unremunerative branch lines had been closed or turned over to freight use only. This eliminated expensive staff costs, as most stations still boasted a station master, porters and junior staff, even on rural byways. All this served to make the railway staff insecure and hardened attitudes towards management. Railway staff were not by nature militant. From the earliest days they had regarded their job as a job for life, and they'd enjoyed a certain status in the community. There was a logical career ladder, and there were many different career paths to follow. To many, the archetypal railwayman was either a driver or a station master. In rural parts, the latter would be quite a senior member of the community and would have a large staff under his command. His was a responsible job, as was that of the signalman, and both would work long and unsociable hours. Signalling staff could work in isolated places such as the Cumbrian Mountains, where many of the signal boxes were only accessible from the railway itself. But there were many different types of railway employee. The British Transport Commission was one of the largest employers in the country, employing nearly 630,000 people at nationalisation. These were the men who could now see their standards of living dropping at a time when the government, a government which wasn't friendly to the working man, was publicly saying it wouldn't let the railways compete on even terms with its road transport rivals and wouldn't meet the railway union's demands for an increase in pay. At the beginning of 1955 it all came to the boil, and the 2 railway unions threatened to bring their members out in a national strike to back up the claim. The loyal railwaymen had had as much as they could take of unfair treatment, and they supported the union leaders and voted to take action. The effect this had on the British people can be gauged by the reports that were given by the newsreels. The whole country was involved.
Soon the railways of Britain will be brought to a standstill if 400,000 workers carry out their threat to strike. Once our railways were a matter of national pride. Swift, efficient, second to none. A few will forget their immense contribution to the war effort. But now there is dissatisfaction on all sides. The public complain of poor service, irregular timetables, obsolete rolling stock, and the vast losses that have to be paid from their own pockets. The railwaymen complain of poor pay. Now they are demanding an increase, and unless they get it, the railways will be halted. At Unity House in London, the headquarters of the National Union of Railwaymen, discussions are underway to arrange full details of the strike. Assured that 28 district councils are in favour of the stoppage, President Stafford and other members of the NUR executive make their decisions. The General Secretary of the Union, Mr. Campbell, is on the left. Unless there is a last-minute change of plan, it seems certain that the strike will take place, so determined are the railwaymen. A strike on such a wide scale would hamstring the country within a matter of days.
A vital question as the new year came in was, will Britain's railway system be brought to a standstill? Some 400,000 railwaymen were under strike orders for January the 9th, but a court of inquiry had been set up at the law courts. Mr. Campbell, General Secretary, and Mr. Stafford, President, put the case of the NUR. Public interest was naturally keen. Here's a cue for the gallery. Representatives of the British Transport Commission were headed by Mr. Allen, Chief of Establishments and Staff, who explained the difficulty of finding the money for extra pay. The whole country, of course, hoped that a settlement could be reached, enabling British Railways to carry on full speed ahead.
The Ministry of Labour provided the opportunity for a meeting between the NUR and the British Transport Commission leaders to discuss the report of the Court of Inquiry, but time was running out. Meanwhile, the Cabinet met at number 10 Downing Street to review the latest developments in the railway dispute and to make plans for all emergencies. Work was naturally going on at high pressure both here and at the Ministry, where Sir Brian Robertson, chairman of the BTC, is seen leaving. The NUR General Secretary, Mr. Campbell, was off to meet his executive.
Well, the position at the moment is that we've received certain assurances from the British Transport Commission. Depends greatly on the decision of my executive. But the Minister is holding himself in readiness and at our service in the event of us desiring to come back.
Thanks to Sir Walter Monckton's work for conciliation and to wise counsels prevailing, strike action was suspended. For the time being, British Railways carry on.
At the Railway Clearinghouse, London, the railway executive and leading members of the three unions concerned met to discuss the critical situation. The General Secretary of the NUR, Mr. Figgins, took a prominent part, and the problem was to deal with railwomen's dissatisfaction with the 5% wage increase proposal and working conditions.
London's railway stations tell the story of the strike that began over the Whitsun holiday. Similar scenes could be witnessed throughout the length and breadth of the country. The gravity of the situation was, if anything, emphasized by the rare train that ran. There was, however, a big exodus to the seaside. Roads were more crowded than ever, and progress was slow. Next day, it was a question of getting to work. This was indeed a difficult question for a lot of people, but many motorists came to the rescue. Great inconvenience, however, was now a certainty for everybody. Sorry about the lorry. The strike settlement produced great excitement out at the Ministry of Labour. Sir Brian Robertson, Chief of the Transport Commission, gave us this comment.
The only thing that I would like to say this evening is this. Please remember that these men who have been on strike are our men, and we don't want to leave a sense of bitterness among them.
Now, Mr. Campbell, General Secretary of the NUR.
We offer no objection to the settlement, particularly as the interests of the NUR have been completely safeguarded in the discussions that are to follow. A referee will be appointed, Lord Justice Morris, and we'll take advantage of submitting our views to the referee.
Here's Mr. Beatty, General Secretary of ASLEF.
What would you like to say at the newsreel now?
Yes. I'm glad it's come to an end. We look forward to the days of success. So we're hoping by tomorrow to see British Railways, which have always been a proud part, working normally and to the satisfaction and pride of all concerned.
And Sir Wilfred Needham, Chief Conciliation Officer at the Ministry.
And I'd like to say that it has been one of the most difficult problems we've had to deal with for quite a long time in the Ministry, but it has had a happy ending, and I'm quite sure everybody will be very much relieved.
Finally, a word from Sir Walter Monckton, Minister of Labour, who did so much to bring about the settlement.
I'm just going off to the House to announce that the strike is over. I've never been more satisfied at the end of a strike in my life.
The initial strike had been proposed by both the National Union of Railwaymen and the Footplatemen's Union, ASLEF. The Whitsun strike was ordered by the latter. The effect of the strike on the consciousness of the travelling public was severe. It appears that it cemented the attitude that trains couldn't be relied upon anymore, and is considered to have been significant in the rush towards private motoring which was gathering pace in the 1950s. Although they received a just settlement, railway staff were still losing out in terms of purchasing power, and the them and us situation had become more ingrained as a result. The strike lasted just 2 weeks, but its effects would last for many years. Although passenger numbers would quickly return to pre-strike levels, the long-term trend was now downwards. Only commuters were now really beholden to the railways. Those whose travel arrangements could be varied, especially day trippers and holidaymakers, would increasingly turn to the road alternatives. The strike had also emphasised that railway pay was no longer competitive and further affected recruitment, especially in urban areas where it became more and more difficult to find staff to do the more menial tasks. Staff reductions were now the simplest way to reduce costs, and overall staff levels fell by 78,000 from 1948 to 1956, some 12% of the total. A major part of the problem was the longevity of railway assets. Few were designed for a life of less than 25 years, which meant that long-term planning for coaches and locomotives, disrupted by the war, was now out of step with the requirements of the post-war world. Steam locomotives required a driver and a fireman, together with ancillary crews such as cleaners, firelighters and shed disposal staff. Some progress had been made in reducing this high staff level on the old Southern Railway, as electric trains required just a driver and less staff at the depots. The trains could be easily cleaned, as they were just carriages and the dirt associated with steam was all but eliminated. This had taken place with little or no unrest. Now, however, when new diesel locomotives were introduced in the 1950s, union efforts to retain the jobs of their members following the bitter disputes and strikes meant that double manning, in other words keeping a fireman as well as a driver on locomotives that didn't have a fire, became a hotly contested issue, which saddled the railways with unnecessary costs at a time when they were under huge pressure. Despite all this, it wasn't all doom and gloom on British Railways in the early days of nationalisation. The Southern's electrification programme would be restarted in the 1950s after a 20-year hiatus, but the replacement of the earliest trains was one of the few investment plans that did continue. Although locomotives were the glamorous part of the railway image, it was coaches that actually carried passengers, and the team which produced the standard locomotive fleet also designed a range of standard coaches. The first ones were locomotive-hauled stock delivered in the colourful red and cream livery, popularly known as blood and custard. They became known as the Mark I range and were produced in many different forms. They incorporated many of the best features of the coaches produced by the Big Four, but it was the Southern designs by Oliver Bulleid that had the greatest influence. These Mark I coaches would be built over a period of some 20 years, and the basic structure would be used for all types of coaches, express, suburban and electric, from the mid-1950s onwards. Their construction used separate underframes and bodies, and 2 different lengths were produced. They would be the public face of the railway for a good half-century, especially in the south, where the general design would yield anything from single-vehicle powered luggage vans to the familiar slam-door multiple units. The Southern would be the last to have trains built to the Mark I specification in the early 1970s. The Mark I third-class coach became the most common passenger-carrying vehicle to be used on Britain's railways of all time. Over 2,500 were produced for locomotive haulage, together with many more included in multiple unit trains. This number included both compartment and open types. Up until the 1930s, almost all coaches were of the compartment type, but then open or saloon stock was gradually introduced for excursion services such as seen here. The Mark I open stock could carry 64 passengers in seating bays arranged in facing pairs with a central gangway. This was to become the most common layout for third-class passenger stock thereafter, third class being redesignated to second class in 1956. Large movements of excursion passengers, such as are evidenced here, would become an increasing problem for British Railways over the next decade, as it meant that many carriages would be only used occasionally. Some locomotives would be used for only a few days a year, and even a few of the virtually new Bulleid Pacifics would be placed in store in the winter in the early 1950s. But the railways did have some fans. The 1950s was to see the rise of a generation of loco spotters. Today we have train spotters.
For their train to be drawn by the world speed record-breaking Mallard, number 60022, was an extra thrill for schoolboy loco spotters. Nearly 1,000 of them went aboard at King's Cross for the trip to Doncaster to have a look at the construction and repair sheds there. Meanwhile, notebooks and pencils went into action during the journey. Spotting engines is one thing, and a very popular pastime it is. But at Doncaster, these club members were able to get a real close-up in the Eastern Region works. They saw how locos are made, and they saw not only the wheels, but also what makes the wheels go round. To judge by our pictures of the boys' inspection, absolutely nothing was taken for granted. Incidentally, to round off a perfect excursion, the Spotters Express was even involved in a slight accident on the way back.
The loco spotters were the future generation of railway enthusiasts. In the 1950s, their fathers were busy laying the foundation of the great preservation movement, which would keep the spirit of the historic steam railways alive into the future. It all started in the mountains of northwest Wales. In 1951, the Talyllyn Railway was taken over by a group of enthusiasts, and it was to kick-start the whole preservation movement. In the same year, and emboldened by the success of that venture, a new group was formed to purchase the moribund Festiniog Railway, located near Mount Snowdon. The Talyllyn had never closed, but the Festiniog needed a complete rebuild before it could be returned to service. A trust was formed, and in June 1954 the railway passed into the preservationists' hands. 1 year later, the first trains ran under preservation auspices. The locomotive Prince was one of the original Festiniog Railway locomotives, dating from 1863, when the railway was granted permission to carry passengers, the first narrow gauge railway in Great Britain to win this approval. In that first year, trains only ran from Port Maddock to Boston Lodge, across the famous Cobb, the causeway across the estuary of the River Glaslyn. Boston Lodge was the site of the railway's works, which were progressively reopened and used to overhaul the acquired stock and then to build new bogie coaches for the rapidly expanding railway. Over the course of the next few years, the Festiniog Railway continued to expand back along the original route of the line. It was to set a number of benchmarks for the future, the most notable one of which was the construction of an entirely new stretch of line high up in the mountains towards Blaenau Festiniog. This was the result of a hydroelectric scheme which involved the compulsory purchase and flooding of part of the original trackbed, thus severing the railway from its original terminus in Blaenau Festiniog itself. The preservationists set to build the new formation on a higher elevation to the original, the work including the necessity to bore a new tunnel. This was in the mountains and inaccessible by road transport. The railway itself was the only form of transport to get volunteers and materials to the site, and the project attracted large numbers of such volunteers. Working parties would come to the Welsh mountains from all over Great Britain and spend the weekends or summer holidays carving and blasting through the rocks until a new railway was created. The achievement showed that amateurs and volunteers could do almost anything. Such was the success of the Festiniog volunteers that they attracted the interest of the news services, who did much to publicise their work, further enhancing the burgeoning preservation movement.
Over 100 years ago, it was 1 horsepower on the Festiniog line. No doubt many Victorians regretted the passing of the horse-drawn train, even though its successor, the line's first locomotive, had a charm all its own. Let's take a trip along the original track. Almost half of it has now been restored. The inventors Brunel and Stevenson doubted whether a locomotive could work successfully on Festiniog's 2-foot gauge. They were certainly proved wrong. The line, originally built for the slate trade, runs through the magnificent scenery of the Snowdonia National Park. Not surprisingly, it's become a considerable tourist attraction. More than 100,000 people made the trip last year.
British Railways had acquired another of the Welsh narrow gauge railways as part of the Great Westerns group of lines. This was the Welshpool and Llanfair Light Railway, which became a victim of the nationalised concern's mounting losses and was slated for closure at the end of 1956. The success of the Talyllyn and Ffestiniog Preservation Societies had focused attention on the Welsh narrow gauge railways, and the last day of the Welshpool line attracted a huge gathering of enthusiasts. This would set in motion another preservation attempt, this one being the first to try to take over a railway from British Railways itself. Both the previous ones had been taken over from private operators. There was no precedent for a takeover from the nationalised concern, so the nascent Preservation Society had to work through many layers of bureaucracy. One problem was the location of the terminus at Welshpool itself, alongside the main line station. This had always been a problem during the line's working days, as all through passengers had to change trains here, at least until 1931, when the Great Western discontinued passenger services and disposed of the coaches. Freight had carried on until 1956, but was also subject to transshipment at Welshpool from the standard gauge to the narrow gauge. However, both the railway's original locomotives survived to the end, and number 822 was available for the last train services organised by the Stevenson Locomotive Society. The passengers had to travel in the open wagons, which were all that was left of the railway's original rolling stock. Some lucky passengers could sit on the wooden benches, but the majority had to stand. This could be somewhat hazardous in small wagons on a narrow gauge railway. The line ran through the streets of Welshpool and alongside the main road to Llanfair Cerinian, crossing the latter at Raven Square on the outskirts of Welshpool, where a brass band greeted the tour. Sadly, the section from Welshpool Station to Raven Square would not be available to the preservationists, as the local council wanted to build a car park and a bypass for Brook Street alongside which the line ran. The negotiations with British Railways carried on until 1961, when a lease was drawn up, at last opening the way for the Preservation Society to reopen the Welshpool and Llanfair Light Railway, as we'll see later in our story. The gauge was, and still is, unusual, being 2 foot 6 inches, unlike the other Welsh narrow gauge lines, most of which have a 1 foot 11.5 inch gauge. This made it difficult for the preservationists to locate alternative coaches to replace those which had been disposed of by the Great Western, but by the time the line reopened in 1963, another source had become available from an Admiralty line in Kent. We return to the main British railway system on the former Great Northern Railway's main line into London, the southern part of the East Coast Main Line. This illustrates the state of the railways in the mid-1950s on the eve of mass dieselisation and the advent of the modernisation plan, which was announced in 1955. The backlog of maintenance from the war was overcome by the end of 1953, and the railways began to show evidence of improvement following the introduction of the new Mark I carriages. However, it was still essentially the same railway that had existed before the war. Much of the non-passenger coaching stock and refreshment cars were still of pre-nationalisation design, and the products of the latter were not particularly well received by the travelling public. Tastes had changed, but the railway's catering was still based on full sit-down menus with silver service. Passengers were now wanting lighter snacks and meals, and some progress was being made to convert some restaurant cars to buffet cars to cater for this demand. The bullied tavern cars had been intended for this market, and had been used on other regions' trains, including the Eastern. They, however, were disliked for their claustrophobic interiors as a result of being fitted with small windows which prevented passengers from enjoying the passing scenes such as we see here. The train has just passed the carriage sidings at Holloway and is now about to pass the upside goods yard, beside which more coaches were stabled. Huge sorting sidings were arranged alongside all main lines throughout the system, and were one of the least efficient parts of the railway's business, although this had been little understood up until now. However, the costs of shunting and remarshalling stock had now become the focus of the railway's accountants. Part of the crisis into which British Railways had plunged could be ascribed to these costs. Here can be seen a large variety of the traditional British goods wagons which had seen little change in design through the first half of the 20th century. So far, the most noticeable change here was the employment of diesel shunters instead of steam, a policy which was part of the standardisation scheme of the early 1950s. Large orders were placed for diesel shunters based on a design by the LMS and English Electric, which was introduced in the 1930s. The London suburban area was one place in which British Railways hadn't taken over all the lines. BR was one of the executives of the British Transport Commission, another of which was the London Transport Executive. The latter's predecessor, the London Passenger Transport Board, had set out a new works programme for the 1935 to 1940 period, much of which was uncompleted by the outbreak of war. Upon nationalisation, the British Transport Commission concentrated its limited resources on British Railways to the detriment of LT, and some of those projects, including the extension of the Bakerloo and Northern lines to Camberwell and Bushey Heath respectively, were abandoned. Some of its services still weren't electrified and were worked by British Railways steam locomotives, an arrangement which had been inherited from the LNER. London Transport's main priority became the electrification of these, notably to Epping and Ongar, which were taken over from British Railways in 1949 and 1957 respectively. In the west, electrification of the Metropolitan line from Rickmansworth to Amersham and Chesham was authorised in 1956, which would effectively complete the electrification and independence of the London transport system. The tracks were shared with British Railways, as they had been used by the Great Central Railway at the end of the 19th century to obtain access to London. Some of the Metropolitan line coaching stock seen here was the oldest in regular use on Britain's railways in the 1950s. The newest were the diesel multiple units. The train seen here on test is made up of Swindon Intercity units, which were intended for use on services between Glasgow and Edinburgh on the Scottish region. The genesis of these units can be traced back to the year of nationalisation, when a committee was set up to recommend on future train requirements. While steam was to be continued for freight and express passenger work, the committee, after 4 years' study, recommended that a fleet of diesel railcars should be built for use on branch lines and local services. It also recommended that trials should be undertaken in specific areas so as to be able to make the trials as efficient as possible. Amongst those areas was the Glasgow to Edinburgh main line, effectively a self-contained service. Swindon was commissioned to design and build a series of 21 three-car diesel sets, which would have gangways at one end to enable them to be coupled to form a six-car set. The committee recommended 3 types of diesel units: Type A for local and suburban services, B for cross-country, and C for intercity services. This was the first use of the latter title, and these Swindon units were the first to be built to that specification, appearing in 1956. But the first of the standard British Railways diesel multiple units of all were the so-called Derby lightweights of Type A. In accordance with the committee's recommendations, they went into service in 1954 on the Bradford to Leeds line.
All set for a trial run in Yorkshire from Bradford to Leeds is one of British Railways' new lightweight diesel trains. The introduction of these trains is part of a scheme to make rail travel in this country faster, cleaner, more pleasant, and even, yes, they've thought about it at last, on time. Advantages over steam include the need for less depot servicing because they're so much cleaner and easier to run. Others are better viewing facilities, either end drive, more speed, particularly uphill, and greater acceleration pickup. One-man control saves staff too. In more ways than one, the new diesel car should be able to show the trains of yesterday a clean pair of wheels.
The Swindon-built units, having passed their tests, were introduced on the Glasgow to Edinburgh services during 1956 to a similar fanfare of publicity. The The Intercity title wasn't prominent at this time, the emphasis being on the cleanliness of the new units compared to steam. This was one glimmer of hope during what was to prove to be yet another worst year yet for British Railways. The working deficit had increased from the previous year, and passengers were now deserting rail in increasing numbers. The diesel railcars, the term railcar was used for all diesel units at this time, were the first evidence of modernisation, a modernisation plan having been announced in 1955. These units were ordered before that plan was announced, but their timely delivery gave the impression that modernisation was already underway. It was the first small advance during a period of retrenchment and crisis for the railways. The normal formation of these trains, consisting of 2 3-car units coupled together with gangway connections on the intermediate driving cars, was unique amongst the whole of the diesel multiple unit fleet. All other diesel railcars, except 2 further variations of this Swindon design, had non-gangway ends, and passengers were able to view the line ahead and the driver at work. The Swindon ones were the only ones without the forward view, which actually gave rise to one of the few criticisms of the design. The other was the poor ride, a common problem with many vehicles in the diesel railcar fleet. This was partially because each vehicle in a train had power equipment slung underneath, giving rise to excessive noise. These Intercity units had a large proportion of first-class seating, with centre cars either having 7 first-class compartments or 3 plus a small buffet. The driving cars were second-class only. They were similar in specification to the Mark I coaching stock. The second order for units of this type in 1959 were also for use on the Glasgow to Edinburgh services, passenger carryings on which had grown as a result of these trains. One lesson that British Railways learnt early on was to provide dedicated servicing facilities for the new trains. In this case, the old Leith Central passenger station was converted to a special maintenance depot for them. Growth continued into the 1960s, outstripping the unit's capacity once again, so they were redeployed on services to air from 1970. They can safely be described as a success. When finally retired, 4 cars were sold for further service in Liberia. Looking down on the north end of Edinburgh Waverley Station, we see one of the Intercity units, or rather a pair of them in 6-car formation, arriving from Glasgow. One rather old-fashioned feature was the use of oil lamps for the tail lamps on these trains. They also had a single-character head code which displayed the letter A for express passenger on the leading driving car. Coming out of the station to the left is one of the second order for general branch line and local service units of Type B. These were the next type to be delivered to the Scottish region in 1956 and were built by the firm of Metropolitan Camel. This company was the first outside contractor to supply any type of diesel railcar in the nationalisation era, and was the start of a trend towards the use of outside contractors. Eventually these would become the most numerous type of diesel units in British Railways service. On these a different form of 2-character head code was displayed, together with destination lines. Although the term multiple unit is usually used to describe these diesel railcars, the early types were unable to work with vehicles outside their own design. The different control systems were shown on the front of the driving cars by means of a colour code. The standard code for later built diesel railcars was the blue square designation, the symbol for which can be seen on this 1957 built Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company unit. However, its contemporary unit, built at Derby and known as a Derby Heavyweight, doesn't display any code at all, although it too is blue square. These units were similar to the earlier Derby Lightweights, except they were built from steel rather than aluminium. The latter could only work in multiple with each other and were colour-coded red triangle. Although it was the original plan to build all the railcars from aluminium, experience with these Derby Lightweights showed that corrosion was a problem, and allied to higher first cost and more difficult construction techniques, this spelt the end of the use of alloy in railway coaching stock. The general layout of the railcars mirrored that of the conventional coaches which they supplanted, including the provision of plenty of luggage space. However, with the exception of the Intercity units, the seats provided were of low back design and were arranged in saloons rather than the traditional compartments. This enabled more passengers to enjoy the view, whether at the front or back of the train. Previously, such a view was the preserve of premium fare passengers on the top flight expresses, such as the Coronation of 1937 or Devon Belle of 1947. After a few years' service, the railcar driving ends had what were known as speed whiskers painted on. They were actually the predecessors of the yellow warning panels which later disfigured all modern train design. As the fleet was expanded, so was their area of operation. The initial batch of Derby lightweights set the standard form for these trains, each coach being fitted with two 140 horsepower engines, each of these driving one axle of one bogie. This meant that the power was distributed evenly along the train, a layout which will become near universal in the future. The engines themselves were of two main types from two manufacturers, either Leyland or AEC. Some sets for specific duties had Rolls-Royce engines, such as these Calder Valley units, which had 180 horsepower ones to give greater power on the route for which they were intended, which had severe climbs. Around 250 vehicles were built in the first phase before the 1955 modernisation plan was announced. Their success was acknowledged by the fact that the plan would increase the numbers vastly to around 4,000 vehicles. In general, there were very few poor designs, as some experience had already been obtained with these early trains, and the majority of the expanded fleet were based on these prototypes. Other standard features included the internal layout and positioning of the external doors. There were, of course, exceptions, such as the Swindon Intercity units, but many for cross-country or branch line and general services had 3 saloons per vehicle with low-back seats arranged in what would later become known as airline-style seating. Giving the passengers a view of the line, these were normally arranged for 2 seats on one side and 3 on the other across the vehicle, and were known as high density. Others had just 4 seats across and were known as low density. Actual passenger capacity varied from one type to another, but these Calder Valley ones, built by the Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, had seating for 24 first-class passengers situated in the end saloons and 159 second-class passengers. They were a development of the earlier 2-car units from this manufacturer and were the last vehicles it made before going into liquidation. Rather more successful was Metropolitan Camel. Its standard design had a distinctive arrangement at the front and looked unlike any other design. Using the standard AEC or Leyland 150 horsepower engines, they were produced in large numbers, formed into 2, 3 or 4 car sets. Some vehicles were trailers, and the formation and number of power cars varied according to the area in which they were to operate. The Derby lightweights had a unique transmission in the form of a torque converter, but thereafter new units had a standard mechanical gearbox transmission as introduced on the Metcam ones. Again, there were exceptions, generally where the Rolls-Royce engines were installed. A few of these had hydraulic transmissions, but all the railcars were generally grouped together and known as diesel mechanical multiple units, or simply DMUs. The use of gearboxes gave them a distinctive sound compared to diesel locomotives introduced at the same time, most of the latter having engines which turn an electrical generator to drive electric traction motors, thus being known as diesel electrics. The typical DMU could be heard changing gear as it accelerated, a sound that seemed as though it might be about to lose power at any moment. For many passengers in the mid-1950s, the diesel multiple units became the face of British Railways as they took over the rural passenger services. For commuter lines, electrification was seen as the way forward, except on the western region, where suburban DMUs would be introduced, running alongside the famous Great Western steam locomotives such as the Castles and Kings.
Still steam-hauled by magnificent engines are most of the crack trains of the western region. It's no use washing whiter if the Cornish Riviera passes the clothesline. The famous King-class locomotives pull another Western region flyer, the Bristolian. Fastest train in Britain, the Bristolian at times exceeds 100 miles an hour. Its average for the run, 67 miles an hour. It's sad to think that superb locomotives of the King and Coronation class must be superseded. Drivers who know their ways and moods as if the engines lived are loath to bid them goodbye. But soon many will drive diesels. Classes are held to teach them the mysteries of the oil age. And as most men nowadays understand motor cars, the diesel isn't a mystery for long. On main lines, the big diesel engines are gradually replacing the steam loco. In pairs, they've often pulled the Royal Scot to Glasgow in the last 8 years. On this region, as on others, diesel power will largely displace steam, and eventually the main lines will be electrified.
The LMS twins, a smaller mixed traffic machine, and 3 Southern diesels were the only mainline diesels working in Great Britain before the announcement of the modernisation plan in 1955. But in that year, a 7th prototype appeared.
One outstanding item in the modernisation of British railways is the new Deltic diesel-electric locomotive. It's reported that over 20 of them, the most powerful of their type in the world, are being ordered, and that they'll haul such famous expresses as the Flying Scotsman and the Elizabethan. What a contrast the clean diesel-electric makes compared with the old, smoky, coal-burning locos. The Deltic is capable of well over 100 miles an hour. Not going at that speed here, you say? No, it had to slow down so that we could keep up with it in our helicopter. We shall soon be seeing plenty of Deltics.
Sadly, that prophecy would prove to be wrong. The Deltic was a privately promoted prototype locomotive produced by the English Electric Company of Newton the Willows in Lancashire. It was an attempt by that company to produce a type of locomotive which would have high power and low weight. It emerged in October 1955 and was put to use on the West Coast Main Line from Euston. It differed from the early prototypes in many ways. The principal feature was its engine, or rather its engines. Billed as the most powerful single-unit diesel locomotive in the world, it had a pair of 2-stroke engines which had been developed for marine use. English Electric were the leading builders of diesel locomotives in Great Britain in the early 1950s and had supplied the engines, generators and traction motors for the 5 mainline prototypes of the LMS and Southern. These, using normal 4-stroke engines, had proven to be extremely heavy, and the Deltic was seen by English Electric as the future. The 4-stroke engines in the LMS machines produced 1600 horsepower and had been boosted to 2000 in the last of the Southern ones. This engine design was used by English Electric for locomotives for export orders and was thus well developed and robust. The Deltic engine was revolutionary in many ways, particularly in its use of opposed cylinders set in a triangular formation which resembled the Greek letter delta. The name of the engine was thus applied to the complete locomotive, which was outshopped in a striking blue livery. A headlight was fitted as English Electric were hoping to secure foreign orders for the design. It was unique on British Railways in that it never carried a number and was always referred to simply as Deltic. It never became British Railways property. They merely provided the facility to test it on their tracks. Sadly, the design was too advanced and too late, as British Railways, faced with mounting losses, needed simple locomotives to be produced as quickly as possible and as cheaply as possible, albeit at a capital cost of around 4 times that of a comparable steam locomotive. The modernisation plan's pilot scheme locomotives wouldn't include any production Deltics, although some would appear later, as we'll learn when our story continues showing how Britain's railways, following their fall into an operating deficit, tried to rise again. In view of the state into which the railways of Britain had fallen in the decade since the end of the Second World War, there can have been few citizens who were surprised by the announcement by the British Transport Commission that it had drawn up a plan to modernise British railways to enable it to rise once again to a position of preeminence amongst the nation's transport operators. There was just the small matter of obtaining the sum of £1.2 billion from the Conservative government, which hadn't shown itself to be particularly well disposed towards the railways, it having shown a preference for road transport. Not only the government but the general public had a somewhat jaundiced view of the railways, which recorded their first operating deficit in 1955, the year in which the modernisation plan was announced. Nationalised in 1948, the British Transport Commission's Railway Executive, better known as British Railways, had tried in vain to restore the position the railways had enjoyed before the war. British Railways was still dependent on the classic steam locomotive for the majority of its trains, other than on rural branches and cross-country routes, which were benefiting from diesel railcars which had been ordered before the modernisation plan was launched. 6 prototype mainline diesels were still regarded as under test. Steam locomotive development had reached its peak shortly before the war, epitomised by Sir Nigel Gresley's classic Class A4 Streamline Pacifics, one of which Mallard had captured the world's speed record for steam traction in 1938 with a speed of 126 miles an hour. Such a speed was unthinkable on the railway of 1955, although by then the arrears of maintenance from the war years had at last been eliminated. The A4s still represented the top flight of mainline steam on the East Coast Main Line, although the London and North Eastern Railway had produced a more powerful Express Pacific type at the end of its existence. These were the peppercorn Class A1s, the first of which actually appeared after the LNER had ceased to exist in 1948. British Railways Locomotive Committee saw that the future lay in the electrification of the railways as soon as possible, but a lack of investment capital following the country's economic crises after the war had meant that they had reluctantly decided that steam locomotive construction would still be needed until electrification could begin. The modernisation plan of 1955 also envisaged more electrification, but its principal pronouncement on locomotive affairs was that the interim power until full electrification should be diesel traction rather than steam. There can have been few railway enthusiasts who didn't shed a tear when they realised that Miles Beaver, named for one of the LNER's directors, and its fellow A4s were no longer going to be the top locomotives. They were the exception. The general public were fed up with the dirt and image of the steam railway, which King's Cross, seen here, epitomised. They saw the modernisation plan as the way to clean up the railways and bring them into the second half of the 20th century. It would mean the scrapping of nearly 20,000 steam locomotives, a process which was expected to last another quarter of a century or more, the normal economic life of a steam locomotive. No more would be ordered, and then current orders for 162 were cancelled. A further 33 from earlier orders would be cancelled later, leaving a rump of freight engines to be built as the last British Railways steam locomotives of all. The mainline electrification programme would initially be concentrated on the West Coast Main Line, the intention being then to move on to the East Coast Main Line from London to Edinburgh, where we see another A4 arriving with the Talisman, a new afternoon express for the East Coast Main Line introduced on the 17th of September 1956. It still boasted steam power, and the 20-year-old A4s were its normal locomotives. Limited development of steam was still allowed to continue, the A4s all receiving improvements to their exhausts evidenced by double chimneys. At the same time, British Railways changed its coaching stock liveries, the previous blood and custard giving way to a deeper all-over maroon paint finish. A symbol of the new railway was a revised heraldic device for British Railways, applied in a roundel form to coaches of express trains and in a slightly different form to locomotives. As seen here on the clean black Edinburgh pilot locomotive, this ferret and dartboard replaced the previous cycling lion, seen on number 68477, as we run into Waverley. 1956 was to be a watershed year for British Railways. The previous year had seen it plunge into a working deficit for the first time. It lost £17 million, which is about £250 million today. And this year it would get even worse. The modernisation plan had been approved by the Conservative government, even to the extent of increasing the total capital requirement to £1.5 billion. That's around £15 billion today. The first orders for the new pilot scheme diesel locomotives had been placed, and the new trains and liveries gave the impression something was being done at last. The regions, which had effectively replaced the Big Four, LMS, LNER, Great Western and Southern Railways, were given back some degree of autonomy, although funding was still from central government. And herein lay the biggest problem resulting from nationalisation. Each of the Big Four had been responsible, as independent companies, for raising its own capital and thus directing its own investment. Now the modernisation plan directed as to where funds should be spent. Curiously, the old LNER empire had been split into 3 regions, roughly similar to the 3 companies which had worked together so well before the 1923 grouping had created the LNER. The southern portion was the eastern region, whose principal component was the Great Northern. The northeastern region was effectively the North Eastern Railway reborn, whilst the lines north of the border were put in the Scottish region. The latter also included the Scottish lines of the LMS, but that company's English lines remained together as the London Midland region. It was by far the largest part of the British Railways Empire, and now it would receive the lion's share of the modernisation plan funding. As another A4 heads for Aberdeen, it's worth noting that the intentions of the architects of the modernisation plan were honourable and appeared achievable. The plan stated, for reasons which are too well known to require repetition here, British Railways today are not working at full efficiency. This plan aims to produce a thoroughly modern system, able fully to meet both current traffic requirements and those of the foreseeable future. The electrification programme was intended to be a rolling one, with East Coast Main Line wiring to follow on directly from the West Coast one. Had the railways remained independent, these 2 schemes would probably have been advanced in parallel. The East Coast Main Line would suffer greatly from this ordering of priorities. Half of the modernisation plan funding would be swallowed up simply from the need to maintain current assets. The West Coast electrification would take over 10 years simply to reach from London to Manchester and Liverpool. It wouldn't reach Scotland until 1974. The only eastern side electrification to be funded under the plan was for suburban services around London. These would later be cut back to those emanating from Liverpool Street only. The Great Northern Suburban Line's electrification from King's Cross would be rescinded. Here we're passing Haymarket on the Edinburgh to Glasgow main line, for which no plans have ever been put forward for electrification. The only modernisation for this route was the introduction of diesel railcars in 1956, as we saw earlier in our story. In Scotland, electrification was proposed only for the Glasgow suburban system. The Scottish region was seen as a special case within British Railways. Although it had main lines from England by both the West Coast and East Coast routes, its internal lines were considered to be far less commercial than other parts of the system. There were some very lengthy lines serving low-density populations, such as the Highland Main Line to Inverness and the long straggling routes to the West Highlands at Oban and Fort William. The most northerly lines served the isolated communities of Wick and Thurso, and another long line gave the Isle of Skye a connection to the mainland by means of a railway to the Kyle of Lochaush. These were all to be equipped with new diesels under the modernisation plan. The famous main line to Aberdeen across the massive Forth Bridge would also remain unwired. Perhaps the bridge itself summed up the problems facing the railway system. It required constant attention. The phrase, like painting the Forth Bridge, had long been a synonym for a job that could never be completed. No sooner had the painters finished painting the bridge from end to end, a process which would take many years, than it would be necessary to start again at the other end. The expenditure had little commercial return, but without it there could be no railway in the long term. This also illustrates the railway's situation vis-à-vis road transport. The railways have to provide the total infrastructure from trackbed to bridge to station to rolling stock. A road vehicle operator pays a tax to provide all but the vehicle itself. The state provides the infrastructure, and the road haulier doesn't have to give any thought to anything bar maintenance and fuel. The road vehicle can go anywhere, sometimes even where there is no road. Freed up from the constraints of the sea licence system in 1954, the following year road transport carried more freight than the railways for the first time. Although the A4s still headed most of its expresses, the East Coast Main Line remained at the forefront of the railway thanks to the tenacity of its management and the cooperation of the various regional planning departments in a way that echoed the Great Northern, North Eastern and North British Railways half a century before. They were fortunate in having the solid base of the Gresley Pacific Fleet to keep the expresses running, even whilst other routes were experiencing the birth pangs of the new diesel fleets, and the inspired leadership of one of the unsung heroes of the British Railways era in Gerald Fiennes, the Eastern Region General Manager. The result was an order for 22 production Deltic diesels, to whose story we'll return, but it spelt the death knell for the Pacifics such as Gainsborough, seen on the northeast coast. Like the eastern lines, the western region was to go its own way on dieselisation. Unlike the eastern, the western was never even considered suitable for any electrification at all. The fierce independence inherited from the old Great Western was to see a rearguard action that caused British Railways to continue building the distinctive Great Western design pannier steam tank engines until as late as October 1956. The very last ones were a batch of 10 similar to number 8481, which is seen working on empty passenger stock duties at Paddington Station. They would have working lives of less than 10 years. Everything about the Great Western seemed unchanging in the early years of nationalisation. Castles still headed most expresses, and British Railways had even built some of them as well, to what was essentially a 40-year-old design. But things were about to change.
A demonstration run from London to Bristol. He's at the controls of British Railway's new 2,000 horsepower diesel hydraulic loco. A special coach next to the engine was used on this trip to demonstrate and record speed and performance. The plan is the replacement of steam by diesel traction on the western region, giving greater economy, cleanliness and speed.
The western region was to go its own way under the modernisation plan of 1955 and order diesels which were unique to it. Above all, they differed in their transmission, which was a hydraulic torque converter. The first 11 of these diesel hydraulics were built as part of the pilot scheme programme set out in the modernisation plan. The Western was authorised to build 5 of 2,000 horsepower, as seen here, and 6 of 1,000 horsepower, all to be equipped with German MAN engines and Voith transmissions, and built by the North British Locomotive Company, which held the licences. On another front, the Western also went its own way by reminding the world that it was the first to 100 miles an hour.
Here's what she did with primitive power, City of Truro 440, over 100 miles an hour, over 50 years ago. Yes, a wonderful old loco, the first vehicle in the world to do over 100. Now this museum piece has been brought out to haul specials for fans.
The pilot scheme envisaged a total of 161 diesel locomotives for evaluation before mass production could start. They were of 3 basic types, divided according to horsepower. This is a later production version of one of the more successful ones, a Type B, later Type 2, built by Brush Traction. The new developments were showcased by the British Transport Commission in a series of exhibitions.
British Railways plan to make their service the best in the world, and Transport Commission Chief Sir Brian Robertson opens an exhibition to show how it's to be done. Sir Philip Water, Southern Region Chairman, inspects a new diesel-driven coach which is already in production. Also interested is LCC Deputy Chairman, Mrs. Thornton. Diesel power is much in evidence. Here's the 3,300 horsepower diesel-electric locomotive, Deltic, and another of 1,000 horsepower. Transport Minister Harold Watkinson accompanies Sir Brian into a prototype first-class coach, which is the last word in travelling comfort. No need to hunt for a seat facing the engine, you turn it whichever way you want. And here's an ultra-modern adaptation of something to be found in every Victorian home, the Venetian blind. Comfortable, sir? One day, all British Railways coaches will be as luxurious as this.
The new coaches were a series of experimental coaches produced in 1956 to test out certain ideas with a view to incorporating them into the Mark I passenger coaches that were now in general use. The prototypes were placed in service, but few of their innovations were to be taken up. The modernisation plan didn't envisage much in the way of changes to this very successful carriage type, merely the acceleration of its introduction. However, on other parts of the railway, massive changes were afoot.
Before long, railways will only carry coal to industrial areas, not burn it themselves. It's less wasteful to use oil on railways for the time being, till the day when nuclear-generated electricity helps the main lines to be electrified. Meanwhile, the diesel holds the fort. At Paddington, the first diesel hydraulic locomotive built in British Railways' own workshops was named after the chairman of British Transport Commission. The general manager of the Western Region, Mr. K.W.C. Grand, was in charge of the ceremony. Sir Brian Robertson, as head of British Railways, is at the helm of the vast modernisation programme.
The locomotive named after the chairman was the Western Region's own version of a diesel hydraulic. 3 months after the pilot scheme authorisation for the North British locomotives, Swindon secured permission to build 3 more prototypes. These were far more radical than the North British ones. Pilot scheme locomotives and stock continued to be exhibited.
In other spheres too, the accent has been on experimentation and thinking to the future. British trains, for example, with their proud history, are today setting new standards in comfort and performance. At this exhibition at Battersea, London, we take a look at some of the first results of the £1,200 million modernisation and re-equipment plan for the railways, like this 3,300 horsepower diesel-electric prototype, most powerful yet built in this country. Locomotives like the Deltic, with its classical lines and tremendous efficiency, it has a maximum service speed of 90 miles an hour, are undoubtedly more than worthy to follow in the great tradition of the giants of steam that have always captured the imagination of boys from 8 to 80. Less attractive perhaps than the Deltic, but more versatile, is this 1,000 horsepower locomotive, the first mainline diesel-electric to be delivered under the plan. Among the prototype passenger vehicles on view, showing what the trains of tomorrow will be like and built to test public reaction under service conditions, is this attractive first-class carriage with the emphasis on comfort. Note the individually adjustable seats. Another carriage of a different design, this time second class, features more legroom by having 6 seats fewer than in those now in service. These carriages are also equipped with a special powder room for the ladies. The kitchen buffet car, already in service and the basis for this type of car built in the future, is designed to operate with adjoining saloons on services where there is a demand for meals and light refreshments, but which do not need the use of a full kitchen car. Apart from that, it looks nice. Another service that has already been tested successfully is the restaurant buffet car, a self-contained unit with a saloon seating 23 passengers and a buffet. Amenities like these will undoubtedly help realize this great plan to make British Railways the best in the world.
Scorfield Pike, driven from a comfortable cabin that gives little hint of its 2,300 horsepower, was on view at Marylebone Station. It's the most powerful mainline diesel-electric loco to be erected in British Railways' own workshops. 147 more will be running by 1961. Maximum speed will be 90 miles an hour. It's another nail in the coffin of the fine old steam locomotives, whose fatal fault is that they burn too much coal. So oil takes over, as elsewhere on the British system, lines are being electrified. Railway modernisation makes fine headway.
D1, despite its number, was the last of the pilot scheme types to enter service. The pilot scheme was a good plan, even though some of the locomotives built under it were failures, but that was the whole point of it. 10 English electric baby Deltics were a complete disaster, whilst most of the North British machines were extremely unreliable. Also a poor buy were the British Thomson Houston or Clayton Type 1s. Not that you would realise it after this build-up.
May we introduce locomotive number D8200, an 800 horsepower diesel-electric for mainline use. It's the first of its type, and it aroused great interest at Euston when it was handed over to the British Transport Commission. It's also a notable occasion for us, the travelling public, because this loco is part of an impressive plan for faster, more punctual trains. We've got an interest in it, of course, because this nationalised industry is spending £1,200 million of our money on streamlining rail services.
It wasn't the pilot scheme which was a failure, but the panic orders which followed. For example, another type of Class 1 locomotive, this time with a centre cab, was ordered straight off the drawing board from Clayton's as an intended standard class of diesel. They were even worse than the prototypes. 117 were built, the earliest giving such trouble that later built ones went straight into store on delivery whilst the problems were being investigated. This was a catastrophe arising from a crisis. In 1957 the pilot scheme was abandoned and massive orders were placed for new and untried locomotives, a theme to which we'll return later. Other aspects of the modernisation scheme affected most parts of the railway. Level crossings had always been an expensive and inconvenient problem. Every set needed attention by signalling staff or level crossing keepers, and staff were expensive. The plan foresaw all crossing gates being replaced by lifting barriers such as seen here. They would still be attended by signalmen, but remotely from a signalling centre. It's been said that level crossings are the one place where the railway has always had dominion over the car, but in the 1950s road traffic was growing rapidly, and level crossings, with their attendant hold-ups, were yet another reason why the general public had fallen out of love with the railways. The flagship policy of the modernisation plan was the electrification of a number of railway routes. The most important was that of the West Coast Main Line from London to the northwest. It wasn't to be the first mainline electrification. There had been a number of previous ones, notably to Brighton and Portsmouth on the southern region, and from Manchester to Sheffield via the Woodhead Tunnel on the eastern region. The latter had been completed and opened just a year before the modernisation plan was announced, and been trumpeted as the last word in railway technology. In fact, it was an anachronism, having been instituted before the war by the LNER, suspended during the war, and then completed by British Railways. It was the first mainline scheme to utilise overhead wiring and was electrified at 1500 volts DC current. This was the standard laid down by the Ministry of Transport's Pringle and Weir Committee in 1928, which recommended this standard for all future electrification. A number of suburban systems around the country were electrified to this standard between the wars, and it was twice confirmed, latterly by British Railways itself in 1951. When the modernisation plan was announced, 1500 volts DC was proposed for the West Coast Main Line, and initial works were commenced on this basis. The problem with low-voltage DC electrical systems is the requirement to have electricity substations at frequent intervals. The Southern Railway had standardised on 600 volts DC current and needed substations every 4 or 5 miles. This was fine for a system with short runs, but would be a problem on a 400-mile long railway. The overhead infrastructure for a 1500 volt DC system was also quite heavy. Before the Woodhead scheme was even completed, wiser councils began to question the acceptance of the 1928 recommendations. In the quarter century which followed, a great deal was done to investigate the feasibility of much higher voltages, especially on the continent. As the French rebuilt their railways after the massive damage sustained in the war, they adopted a system of 25,000 volts AC, 25 kilovolts, at 50 cycles per second, to match their national electricity supply. Technical advances made this possible, notably in power control, where DC had previously been supreme. This was now the most advanced electrification system in the world, and other countries soon adopted it. As a trial, the former Midland Railway's electrified line from Lancaster to Heysham, itself a trial installation in 1908, energised at 6,600 volts AC, was converted from 25 cycles to 50 cycles, with a view to this being used on the west coast. However, on the 6th of March 1956, the British Transport Commission announced that all forthcoming electrification projects, including the West Coast Main Line, would adopt the same system as the French, 25 kV AC at 50 cycles. Electrifying a railway involves a massive amount of disruption, and the new schemes put forward by the British Transport Commission would take many years to come to fruition. The adoption of the 25 kV AC standard rendered most previous electrification projects obsolete at a stroke. Isolated examples such as the Woodhead route and its associated branches could remain, but where extensions to existing schemes were required, conversion of those existing lines was seen as the most logical way forward. Critics have pointed out that this change to the standard cost the British taxpayer dear at a time when British Railways was already losing money at an alarming rate. But in retrospect it was the correct decision, a rare one for the modernisation plan. One of the first lines to be electrified throughout to the new standard was the London, Tilbury and Southend system from Fenchurch Street in East London to Tilbury and Shoeburyness. In fact, it was electrified with two voltages, 25,000 and 6,250, both AC. This complicated the work and the control equipment in the trains and led to problems with the traction motors, rectifiers and battery chargers. They were overcome at some considerable cost, but it was subsequently decided that the use of the lower voltage was unnecessary after all, and the line and stock were later converted to the single 25 kV standard. One DC scheme to be converted was the former Great Eastern Line from Liverpool Street to Southend. This was already being electrified on the 1500 volt DC system when the modernisation plan was announced. Work continued and it went live in 1956, just as the announcement was being made of the new standards. After just 5 years operation, the line was converted to 25 kV AC, surely one of the most expensive electrification schemes ever. However, the stock was all converted and the rest of the Great Eastern lines to Colchester and Clacton were electrified at the same time to create a unified, modern electrified system. Of course, not all the lines from Liverpool Street were electrified. The main line to Ipswich and Norwich was to be dieselised, the first main line to be so treated under the modernisation plan. Mainline trains were worked by English Electric Type 4 locomotives, whilst outer suburban and semi-fast trains were worked by Brush Type 2 machines. They would be serviced at a new dedicated diesel shed at Stratford.
Inside again, let's look at a depot built specially for the maintenance of mainline diesel locos. A massive glass structure with 6 roads and split-level maintenance, which can handle up to 150 trains like this. Gone are the days when men in the sheds only saw a white shirt at weekends.
As previously noted, in 1956 the carefully crafted and planned pilot scheme was hastily abandoned due to a slump and further heavy losses by British Railways. Instead of waiting to evaluate the pilot scheme locomotives, mass orders were placed for further locomotives to these designs and to even newer ones straight off the drawing board. Fortunately, the Brush Type 2s were relatively successful and the 20 pilot orders were increased to 263. Another aspect of railway operations to come within the modernisation plan was that of freight handling. Old-fashioned shunting and marshalling of wagons was labour-intensive and inefficient. The Big Four had invested in large marshalling sidings in selected areas, but the British Transport Commission was to commit a large part of that £1.5 billion to a massive increase in their numbers. In this, the former LNER regions were to receive a large injection of capital. Some of the modernisation plan's biggest blunders would take place in the field of freight wagons and their handling. The first was in connection with the brakes. Most wagons inherited by British Railways had simple hand brakes only. Those which did have automatic brakes were fitted with vacuum-operated ones when the evidence was that air-operated brakes were far more efficient. Hindsight, a wonderful thing, suggests that the opportunity to equip the wagon fleet at this time with air brakes was woefully missed. The Commission decided to standardise on vacuum brakes. The second was the marshalling yards themselves. These were relevant at the time the Commission committed to them. However, their principle was the automation of the handling of the traditional short wheelbase four-wheeled wagon. Already that was obsolete, although there were tens of thousands of them still in use. changes in the patterns of freight movements were already evident in 1955. A great deal of the railway's troubles stemmed from the use of these old-fashioned wagons, but British Railways was still building them to what were, effectively, pre-war designs. The obligation to take any traffic offered as a common carrier was rescinded in 1957 and gave British Railways the opportunity to cease to carry non-paying traffic. Pick-up goods trains should have started to be phased out then and the wagon fleet modernised. The railway could now concentrate on the types of traffic to which it was most suited, long-distance bulk traffic, but its assets weren't yet suitable. The marshalling yards investment programme would create 55 new marshalling yards and see 145 smaller yards close. Many of the new marshalling yards would themselves be redundant within 10 years. These scenes were recorded at the great marshalling yard established at Tinsley on the eastern side of Sheffield. Undoubtedly it made the handling of the wagons more efficient and concentrated the traffic of a very busy area in one place. It was on the cusp of the London, Midland and Eastern region boundaries and served the steel mills and heavy industry of Sheffield and Rotherham. Tinsley was a typical modernisation plan marshalling yard. These were all built to a similar specification, featuring hump shunting and a series of receiving and sorting sidings. Wagons were pushed to the top of the hump, from which they ran down by gravity towards the sorting sidings, their speed being controlled by a series of retarders which, together with the points, were controlled by an operator in the control office. Some, like Tinsley, had a purpose-built diesel locomotive depot built on the site. Construction was spread over a period of about 8 years, so some of them weren't even opened until well into the time when it was realised that British Railways was no longer going to continue to be in the market for which they'd been devised. As with most aspects of the modernisation plans, the newsreels recorded progress.
The plan provides for the concentration of marshalling into fewer highly mechanised centres. In fact, we already have places like Temple Mills here, most modern marshalling yard in Europe, with novel features like what appear to be robot trucks operating themselves. The method is worked by the automatic operation of primary retarders, which ensure that wagons descend from the hump at the optimum speed for safe shunting. Weight and approach speed are first measured by mechanical and electronic equipment, which passes on the information to the retarder mechanism by the time the wagon reaches it. Secondary retarders are operated from the control tower. With the new marshalling yards handling many times the amount of freight they have in the past, new goods sheds with every labour-saving contraption, like this one at Peterborough, are being built.
The southern region's share of the modernisation plan was the much-delayed resumption of electrification. However, notably on the Hastings main line, for which a series of diesel-electric units were built, specially adapted to cater for its restricted or narrow loading gauge, there were variations to the old Southern Railway's plans. A recognition of one of its commercial rivals, air transport, was the construction of a new station on the Brighton main line south of Red Hill to accommodate traffic from the new Gatwick Airport, which is seen in the throes of construction. An airport had existed here since 1930, when a flying club was established. Commercial flights started to Paris in 1936, at which time trains started to call at the old Gatwick Racecourse station, which had existed here since 1891, and the airport was used by the RAF during the war. In 1952 it was selected as the site for London's second airport, to Heathrow, as it tended to have a rather different weather pattern to the principal London airport. Previously, if aircraft had to be diverted from Heathrow due to adverse weather conditions, such as fog, aircraft were diverted to places such as Blackbush or Herne, which tended to share Heathrow's weather. It was also chosen thanks to its proximity to the Brighton main line, which would give it direct access to the centre of London's West End. The project was started in March 1956, when the existing airport was completely closed to allow construction to start. The main terminal buildings were constructed alongside the railway, and a covered way gave direct access to a new station built for the railway. Construction took 2 3/4 years and cost £7.8 million. Airport and station were opened by the Queen on the 9th of June 1958. The major southern project was electrification to the Kent coast, some 20 years after the Southern Railway had proposed it. a documentary recorded the planning processes needed for this.
Over big areas, such as the Kent Coast Electrification Scheme, aerial camera survey does the work more efficiently and far more quickly than could be done by ground surveyors. The films, taken so as to overlap slightly, make a complete picture of the area covered. From this picture, Southern Region engineers worked out details of plans necessary for the Kent Coast scheme and then submitted them for expert examination by the Southern Area Board, its chief engineers and top executives. One of the earliest parts of the railway modernisation programme, it was urged forward by Sir Philip Water, the board chairman. Wherever required by Chief Operating Superintendent S.A. Fitch and his team, models were made. Though only part of the 15-year plan, the Kent Coast scheme is a tremendous undertaking. The cost will be 45 millions. 250 route miles will be electrified, and the first phase of the scheme, as far as Ramsgate, Dover and Sheerness, will operate by June 1959. By 1962, all lines in Kent will have been electrified, and the Kent Coast Line will not only carry the heavy and always increasing holiday traffic, it'll also improve residential services for people working in London. British Railways Southern Region gives top priority to a £25 million scheme to modernise the lines to the Kent Coast, including the last word in electric and diesel-electric locos, 58 of them in all, to make the service cheaper and cleaner. Electrification's only part of the plan. Traffic's increasing all the time and more tracks are needed to let the fast trains through while the suburban trains make their stops. Sir Philip Water, Chairman, and Mr. C.P. Hopkins, General Manager of Southern Region, inspect progress on the scheme, which is due for completion by June 1959. On the Rainham and Newington section, 100,000 tons of earth have been moved. Newington Station is being rebuilt to allow for 4 tracks instead of 2, and half a dozen other stations are receiving major alterations. The Kent Coast Line carries continental traffic, suburban traffic, holiday traffic, long-distance commuters, and of course freight. With more tracks, fewer curves, colour light signalling, new rolling stock and electric power all the way, Southern Region will soon be bringing London a lot nearer to the sea.
Margate and other northeast Kent resorts are brought nearer to London by the latest in railway modernisation. The Kent Coast Special made the inaugural run from Victoria. VIPs present included Sir Brian Robertson and Sir Philip Water. Here, with the General Manager Southern Area, was the Mayor of Ramsgate. He was among the trainload of guests invited to sample the journey by a new train on the newly electrified line of the Southern Region's Southeastern Division, 4 tracks along most of the way. Buffet cars will be as popular with passengers as with the guests on the first trip. 27 bridges have had to be enlarged or rebuilt. Sir Brian Robertson mingled with the travellers. The Director General of French Railways complimented him on the train's comfort. 6 days after this run began the once-an-hour express service, supplemented by several semi-fast trains. To the well-known resorts, it's not only a holiday trade boon, it must also mean that thousands of workers living in London will go down there to live. To the Mayor of Margate, Sir Brian Robertson must see manna from heaven, and so must the Chairman of the Southern Region, Sir Philip Water. 2 top railway executives from Belgium came over to inspect the scheme, so the Mayor welcomed good company to Margate. Soon, thousands of jaded city folk will live in the tonic air of the Kent Coast. Thousands more will pop down for the day. It's so quick, harassed mothers in London will soon be telling their children after tea, go down to Margate and play on the sands till bedtime.
As mentioned in the documentary, the scheme was in 2 phases. The Southern had been exempted from the requirement to use 25 kV AC overhead electrification due to the wide extent of its existing electrification, so the second phase was to extend the third rail to the Channel ports via Tunbridge and Ashford. At Folkestone, a new central station was established, and the infamous Folkestone Harbour branch, with its severe gradients necessitating the use of as many as 4 banking engines, was also to be electrified, thus eliminating the problem. Completion of this project would mean that all the major towns and the city of Canterbury would be brought within commuting distance of London, and the famous Sparks effect was to be felt in Kent from the late 1950s onwards. Train running patterns would be completely changed, the introduction of regular and frequent clock-face timetables being the most important change to operating practices. The electrification would also lead to the elimination of many obsolete steam locomotives and the transfer of the more recent examples to the parts of the Southern Region which still required them. Kent-Coast scheme completed the electrification of all mainline services within the central and eastern divisions of the southern, which would henceforth be served by the ubiquitous electric multiple units, or EMUs. However, the channel ports still needed special boat trains. The EMUs would provide a regular service thence, but the Golden Arrow and the night ferry services had unique locomotive-hauled stock, the night ferry continuing to be taken aboard a special ferry to give through workings to France. For these services, the Southern ordered a series of 24 electric locomotives built at Doncaster Works. They were a development of 3 electric locomotives produced by the Southern Railway in 1941, and, like them, had booster flywheels to enable them to negotiate gaps in the third rail power supply. It was also intended to use them on freight workings in the electrified area. In order to avoid the danger posed by a third rail installed in shunting yards where there were many staff working, they were fitted with pantographs to pick up electricity from overhead wires in those yards. These were only to give access to the yards, as shunting would be undertaken by diesel shunters. The Golden Arrow service was always seen as a prestige train, and British Railways gave it priority in the early 1950s when 2 of the then new Britannia-class steam locomotives were provided to work it. From 1961 it was placed in the hands of the new electric locomotives. The Pullman coaches for the train were also provided new in the early 1950s, it being one of the Festival of Britain trains, a number of which were equipped with new coaches at the time of that post-war exhibition. The new electrics had a somewhat checkered career. As pure electric locomotives, they suffered from the fact that most freight traffic on the busy Southern electric system was run at night to keep it away from the busy commuter services. Unfortunately, that was also the only time that maintenance could be done, and such work required the switching off of the electricity supply. 24 machines were too many for the work available, which was, in any event, the part of British Railways traffic which was rapidly decreasing. Most of the class was out of use by the mid-1970s, although 10 were withdrawn in the mid-1960s to be converted to electro-diesel operation on the South Western Division. The South Western Division comprised the lines from Waterloo Station. The suburban services had started to be converted to third rail electric operation from the middle of the First World War, and most had been done before the advent of the Second World War. This left the main lines to Southampton and Bournemouth and the west of England still in the hands of steam locomotion. The Southern had plans to electrify both those routes, but its plans were suspended firstly by the advent of war and then the parlous financial situation which followed. No funds were allocated to this potential project in the modernisation plan, so at the end of the 1950s steam trains still threaded their way amongst the myriad of electric services on the complex approaches to Waterloo Station. Despite the delays, it can be said that the Southern's overall plan was still being adhered to. The intention was always that the most modern steam locomotives would be moved from a newly electrified area to the remaining non-electrified ones. This now took place once again, as the Kent-Coast scheme was completed. The South Western Division received a large number of steam locomotives from the Kent area, which enabled it to dispose of many older classes. All the charismatic Bulleid Pacifics, all 140 of them, were now concentrated on the South Western, 90 of them in a modified form which made them the most up-to-date steam locomotives on British Railways. This rebuilding took place from 1956 to 1961, and together with a number of standard steam locomotives provided the South Western with a fleet of steam locomotives, many of which were less than 10 years old. The Bulleid Pacifics had been controversial since their inception. The first had been built during the Second World War in response to the delays to the electrification plan. 30 of the original version, the Merchant Navy class, were built, and they handled the prestige expresses such as the Bournemouth Belle Pullman train. After the war, a smaller version, known as the Light Pacifics or West Country and Battle of Britain classes, was introduced, 110 being built. Bulleid had incorporated a number of features to try to make the locomotives easier to maintain, but these had merely added complications. In the mid-1950s, British Railways decided to remove the unconventional features and produced a more efficient and totally up-to-date locomotive with a potential 15 to 20 year life ahead of it. So, with no provision for electrifying its southwestern main lines, this left the southern region as the last part of British Railways running a modern service entirely with steam traction. Elsewhere, despite mounting losses, there were, at last, the first signs appearing of a new railway. But there were to be even greater problems to be overcome before the railways of Great Britain stopped falling and started to rise once again. But before that happened, there was a final ceremony to be recorded.
Steam engines have been built at Crewe for 115 years, but this is the last they'll ever make. Nowadays, steam's giving way to diesel-electric power. Over 7,300 engines have been built at Crewe, and that's a lot of locomotives. But times are changing, and one day, even this newborn monster will be just a number in a schoolboy's scrapbook, just a stack of steel on the scrap heap.